Chapter 292. As the disciple of a divine-level expert, he was doted on by the divine-level expert, who had even created the snake of engulfment just for him. Moreover, Holt's talent was 1 in a million. Therefore, an existence like Holt would naturally have many people following him wherever he went, or rather, wanted to get close to him. This was the case for the few people around him. This was especially so for the quick-witted man who had spoken earlier. His name was Norman, and he had been following Holt the most for the past month. He had often helped Holt to flatter him. Norman was ranked 41st in the academy, at level 22, and he cultivated archery. However, he was already 39 years old, and there was still one more year before he would turn 40. This meant that his achievements in martial arts would only be SOSO for the rest of his life. It was basically impossible for him to make any great progress. This was also a problem that many conferred knights had encountered. They might be able to cultivate very quickly at the knight stage, but when they reached the conferred knight stage, they would realize that they were lacking in terms of their mental state and will, as well as their lack of talent in comprehending ether particles. People like this would usually leave the academy when they reached a bottleneck after realizing that they did not have any talent. With their status as conferred knights, they would usually be able to get a good job after graduation, as well as a respectable status. However, Norman's ambitions were even greater. He could have graduated 5 years ago, but he had stayed behind to get to know more conferred knights and to make preparations for where he would go after graduation. To him, Holt's appearance was like honey that had appeared before a black bear. Regardless of which corner of the world he was in, there would be unparalleled benefits to being able to form a relationship with a divine-level expert. As the disciple of a divine-level expert, Holt was naturally used to people like this, and he even enjoyed it. Hearing Norman's words, Holt smiled and said, "Thankfully, the melancholic monarch's reward allowed me to quickly attain heaven's perception. That Fangxing John really has great talent. If not for the fortuitous encounter at the Pantheon Monument, I'd probably need another half a year to surpass him completely. However, I reckon that he should have just completed the second transition. I wonder when he'll come to the Killing Techniques Palace." Norman tactfully said, "Haha, when that guy comes over, he'll probably be staring at you with his eyes wide open. Moreover, your job is the Astral Sword Saint. Among all the second transition jobs, this should be the best, right? Astral Sword Saint. I heard that the Astral Ancestor, Holt's Grandmaster, one of the divine-level experts of this generation, used to have a second transition job as the Astral Sword Saint." The other students who had followed Holt also started to suck up to him, saying, "With your talent in sword arts, it'll take at most half a month to clear the Killing Techniques Palace." "That's right. If we use the level 29 Crimson Flame, we should be able to clear the dungeon in a few days." Holt shook his head and said, "I'm here to learn. It's meaningless to rely on a divine weapon to pass." The few of them chatted and laughed as they entered the Great Hall, arriving at the first level of the Killing Techniques Palace. However, right now, there was no one in the Killing Techniques Palace which taught the Thunderbolt sword technique. There was only the charred ground, the damaged walls, and a lonely, huge sword in the middle of the palace. "What's going on? Where is he? Is the time correct?" "That's right. At this time, it should have just started in the afternoon. Why isn't there a single teacher here?" Norman also frowned as he looked at the damaged area. He then smiled and said to Holt, "He's probably eating or going to the toilet. Let's wait for a while." Holt nodded. After all, he felt that he had unrivaled talent and did not need any teacher to guide him. He did not care if there was anyone around or not. He walked up and started to read through the Thunderbolt sword technique on the huge sword. The Thunderbolt sword technique was truly an interesting sword technique. As Holt read on, he became fascinated. Therefore, 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes passed, 15 minutes passed, but there was still no one here. Norman said impatiently, "What's wrong with the sword arts department? Why isn't there a single person here? This is too ridiculous." Holt smiled. "It's fine. It's fine if I'm the only one reading it. This Thunderbolt sword technique is really extensive and profound. I should be able to learn it in just 1 or 2 days." "Amazing. I heard that the students in the sword arts department spent 1 to 2 weeks before they managed to learn this sword technique." Holt, as expected of a divine-level expert's disciple, However, you should also be the most powerful person in this generation in the Myriad Stars Palace. Hearing the flattery from the people next to him, Holt smiled and accepted it. It was true that he was proud of his talent, but for some reason, he thought of Fang Xingjian. This opponent who had defeated him in the regional selection had always been a thorn in his heart. I must continue to work hard. I mustn't slack off. After I clear the Killing Techniques Palace and synthesize these 4 sets of sword techniques, I'll look for an opportunity to have another showdown with Fang Xingjian. Just as they were talking, the sound of footsteps rang out. Everyone turned and saw a few middle-aged or even elderly conferred knights walking over. Really? This is too unbelievable. Even if it's just 2 stages consecutively, it's already breaking the record. In the 200 years since the Empire was founded, there's never been such a thing. Faint voices rang out, and when everyone saw the 2 old men in the lead, their expressions turned solemn. Hops, the pillar of the Academy's sword arts department, who was leading a sword arts team by himself, stood at the very front. Next to him was an elderly man with a face full of wrinkles. This elderly man was older, but his status was also higher than Hops. He was the old man who had guarded the Pantheon Monument and watched as Fang Xingjian broke through to the 7th level of the mysteries. He was the governor from 2 generations ago, James. Seeing James leading Hops and a few other conferred knights into the hall, Holt's countenance turned serious, and he said, "Teachers, why are you guys here? Lord James, you've come out as well?" James, the governor from 2 generations ago, waved his hand and said, "I'm no longer guarding the monument. However, that lad David insisted that I do something. There's no other way. I'm a sword practitioner to begin with, so I replaced Hop's position and became the head of the sword arts department." The head of the sword arts department was naturally the person who managed the entire Academy's sword arts department. This position had originally been taken up by Hops, a sword arts expert who had invented many sword techniques and killing techniques and was the leader of the Academy's sword arts team. However, with James' status, and experience, Hops could only give in to him. Moreover, Hops' main focus was on sword arts and was not too interested in those administrative positions. Holt smiled and said, "I've also just come here to learn the Thunderbolt sword technique." Norman, who was standing at the side, tactfully said, "Holt completed the 2nd transition yesterday. In a month's time, he attained Heaven's Perception and found his 2nd transition job, the Astral Sword Saint. Holt will probably be able to attain a breakthrough in the Killing Techniques Palace within a month or 2. The corners of Holt's lips curled up slightly, and there was a hint of smugness on his face. Putting aside the fact that he had spent very little time and was very fast, there were not many people in the history of the Astral Sword Saint job. This was especially so for his Grandmaster, the divine-level expert Astral Ancestor. He had already been an Astral Sword Saint when he had completed his 2nd transition. Moreover, the Astral Sword Saint was able to control astral forces, astral rays, astral storms, and other powers, possessing powerful battle prowess and destructive prowess. Seeing how everyone was chatting, James, the governor from 2 generations ago, nodded and said, "Not bad, not bad." However, there was a hint of impatience in his eyes. Hops did not have that much patience and went straight to the point. "All right, have you guys seen where Fang Xingjian is?" Chapter 293. A group of people followed behind James and the others, while Holt and the others followed suit. The 2 groups made many turns and arrived before a huge crater. Hops was still seriously analyzing the situation in the valley and said, "The one on duty today should be Ronan. His mountain-shifting sword has already reached level 15, and he has grasped the earth-bearing sword. He's able to connect himself with the entire valley. By the looks of it, that's what he's doing." Shaking their heads, the group once again followed James and headed for the next stage. "That's right. I've long heard that Fang Xingjian does as he pleases and is extremely daring. Could he have barged into the Killing Techniques Palace? Or injured someone?" Holt's countenance sank. If Fang Xingjian were to pass 2 stages consecutively, Holt had no confidence that he would be able to catch up to him and surpass him. However, the appearance of the headmaster from 2 generations ago, the current head of the sword arts department, James, as well as the sword arts expert Holt, gave Holt a bad premonition. A surge of indignation rose in Holt's heart, and he thought inwardly, is there really such a great difference between the talents of the 5th and 7th levels of the Pantheon Monument? Holt nodded and said, "It's fine. I'd thought that he lacked legacies and would need to spend a lot of time preparing for the second transition. I should be able to surpass him this time around." To think that he would be able to complete the second transition so quickly. Maybe the job he has chosen is more ordinary. Moreover, even if he succeeds in his job transition and comes to the Killing Techniques Palace, he shouldn't be much earlier than me. He might be in the second stage. Hearing James' question, Hops said, 5 days. I spent 5 days before I managed to learn the mountain shifting sword and then found the flaws of my teacher back then. The people in the surroundings could only smile awkwardly, but no one took it seriously. Instead, they started to secretly evaluate Fong Xingjian's value once again. In his calculations, this was already his limit. Therefore, he believed that even if Fong Xingjian was faster than him, it would not be by much. Holt was well aware of how fast he had managed to attain Heaven's perception and then complete the second transition. In order to catch up and surpass Fong Xingjian, he had been training crazily day and night for the past month. He had even used up quite a number of extremely valuable resources. Only then had he been able to successfully complete all of this within such a short period of time. Could it be Fong Xingjian? Fong Xingjian? But he subconsciously ignored this feeling, or rather, did not want to think about it. Looking at the huge crater, Head of Department James laughed and said, "It seems that the second stage has been cleared as well." Hops, do you still remember how long you took to clear the second stage? However, there was only 1 year left before the national selection next year. It would be a pity if Fong Xingjian couldn't participate in such an important national selection. Yeah, Norman smiled and said, "No matter what, he's the regional champion and has even cleared all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries. If he's been seriously injured, it's normal for Head of Department James and Teacher Hops to be so concerned. It might not necessarily be that he's injured someone. Fong Xingjian has only been in the academy for less than a month. He might have been injured by someone else, but it was still broken by a single sword attack from Fong Xingjian, and even the entire canyon was destroyed." Head of Department James smiled and said, "This Fong Xingjian is a bully. He must have used that sword attack he learned from the Pantheon Monument, right?" With that, Norman sneaked a glance in Holt's direction and noticed that the latter's complexion had improved a lot. After all, in Miracle World, as long as one was strong enough, conferred knights would have the space to be willful. Even if my talent is much weaker, I'll definitely catch up to you. Hee. Fong Xingjian must have used at most 1 to 2 hours. His talent in clearing the Pantheon Monument is really amazing. Head of Department James was even more tempted by Fong Xingjian's talent and the profoundness of the Pantheon Monument. Therefore, he said, "Why don't we take a look?" Everyone present understood what Head of Department James meant and nodded in agreement. It was true. If Fong Xingjian had come to the academy a few years earlier, it would be hard to imagine how much he would have grown. He would have even been able to participate in the national selection next year. Otherwise, why would so many of us be here? Hops waved his hand impatiently. He was someone who was obsessed with sword arts, did not care about his appearance, and hated formalities. How would he have the patience to talk nonsense with these few rascals? The leader of the sword arts team, Hops, was still checking out the situation in the canyon with a solemn expression, trying to determine the situation of the battle. James shook his head and sighed. It's a pity, a pity. If only he had come a few years earlier. At the thought of this, Holt did not say a word and continued to chase after the next round. The people around him looked at each other and followed suit. However, even though they did not know this, no one in the group brought up the matter of Holt catching up to and surpassing Fong Xingjian anymore. This made Holt feel even more displeased. Holt walked out and said calmly, "Then let's go take a look." As he spoke, Hops had already pulled James, the headmaster from 2 generations ago, out and headed for the next stage. The few people who had been following him said, "Why don't we go in and take a look?" Not only that, Hops squatted down and touched the sand on the ground, saying, first, he used the move of absorbing gravity to break Ronan's balance. Then he blasted the gravity upwards and lifted the ground downwards, combining the two swords into one and defeating Ronan in one go. Although no one said anything, they were increasingly curious about which stage Feng Xingjian had cleared. If they knew that this was Feng Xingjian's first day in the Killing Techniques Palace, they would probably be even more curious. Moreover, his abilities, status, and reputation were sufficient for him to do as he pleased. Hearing the word person, everyone present was slightly stunned. Norman smiled and asked, Teacher Hops, you're saying that Feng Xingjian has also come here? There's still a chance. If he catches up to Feng Xingjian in the Killing Techniques Palace. Looking at the crowd leaving without hesitation, Norman smiled awkwardly at Holt and said, I didn't expect that Feng Xingjian has also come to the Killing Techniques Palace. Behind them, Holt and the others looked at the huge crater in astonishment. One of them had cultivated sword arts and had also cleared the Killing Techniques Palace before. He looked at the scene and said, This was originally a canyon. Why has it been filled up? How else can it be filled up? There must have been a battle. Norman smiled awkwardly and said, maybe there were other seniors clearing the stages, and Feng Xingjian just happened to be there. Ha ha. Norman threw a glance at Holt. He had followed Holt for a month and had a better understanding of his temperament. He knew that Holt came from a prestigious clan and was not thick-skinned. Therefore, he said, earlier, the two sirs asked about Feng Xingjian. Maybe this Feng Xingjian has stirred up trouble again. Chapter 294. The group continued to advance, and in the blink of an eye, they arrived at the Heavenly Waterfall Lake in the third stage. Looking at the Heavenly Waterfall descending from the sky, everyone's faces were filled with varying degrees of astonishment. Hop sighed and said, the work of the second-generation headmaster is still astonishing each time I look at it. This Heavenly Waterfall Lake is truly a work of uncanny workmanship. Majestic and majestic. However, Head of Department James had long since started laughing. Ha ha ha. There's no one again? To clear the entire Killing Techniques Palace within a day. Ha ha ha. Hops, has there ever been such a person in the history of the Great Western Region's Regional Academy? No. Hops shook his head and said, it's not just the Great Western Region that hasn't had such a thing happen in the Empire's 8 regions. Feng Xingjian is the first. James nodded in satisfaction and said, he must be learning the lightless sword in the 4th stage. Let's not disturb him and just wait for him here. With that, James took the lead and sat down at the side of the Heavenly Waterfall Lake. It was as if he was admiring the scenery of the Heavenly Waterfall Lake. The many conferred knights exchanged glances. One of them, a man with a scar on his face, frowned and said, Sir, although Feng Xingjian is extremely talented and has outstanding talent, it's not good to let so many teachers and seniors wait for him here. It won't be a good influence, and he'll probably be terrified himself. If one were to translate this, it would probably mean that they were giving Feng Xingjian too much face. By waiting for him like this, they were giving him face, but where were they going to put their faces? It was a pity that Head of Department James did not care about his face at all. What a joke. The reason why he had become the head of the Sword Arts Department was because he had taken a fancy to Feng Xingjian's talent. He had also wanted to persuade Feng Xingjian to reveal the 7 levels of mysteries of the Pantheon Monument to the Regional Academy. What seniority did James have? He was the headmaster from 2 generations ago. At his age, it was no longer possible for him to have great improvements in his martial arts. What he cared about was his reputation, the Academy's future, and the Empire's future. Now that he saw Feng Xingjian's stunning performance once again, the latter had already become a delicious piece of juicy meat in his eyes. He could not help but have a thought in his mind, and that was to protect and escort Feng Xingjian. Therefore, when he heard the Knife Scar man's words, he curled his lips and said, if you were to clear the Killing Techniques Palace consecutively in a single day, I'll wait for you however long you want me to. Scarface was embarrassed by his words and couldn't help but retort, you can't just rely on learning speed to determine who's better, right? There are so many seniors here. Which one of them isn't above him in terms of level, strength, synchronization rate, fame, and status? He was trying to drag the others along with him. However, no one echoed his words. Instead, Head of Department James laughed coldly and said, "We are all martial artists. If we don't compete in martial arts, what should we compete in? Are you comparing who is older and who eats more?" He sneered and said, "Why would the national selection appear? It was to be able to select the most talented, and whoever was the most powerful would be selected. Let me ask you this. Were any of you even half as amazing as Feng Xingjian when you were his age? A 17-year-old genius. His rapid growth period is at least 20 to 30 years away. By the time he reaches your age, what level will he be at? Regardless of whether it was Scarface or the other teachers, they were all rendered speechless at this moment. It was because the talent that Feng Xingjian had displayed was so unreasonable. Head of Department James, who had unified his thoughts, nodded in satisfaction. Although Feng Xingjian's talent was amazing, it did not mean that everyone would listen to you or help you just because you were talented. Even if the previous pope had unrivaled battle prowess and was unrivaled in the world, it would still have been impossible for him to unify the world, much less get everyone to listen to him. This was why James cherished talents and wanted to protect and escort Feng Xingjian. Another teacher pointed to Holt and the others in the distance and said, "Should we let them go?" James threw a glance over and said calmly, "It doesn't matter." In the distance, Holt, Norman, and the others, who had been following James and the others, saw that James and the others had stopped. One of the students asked curiously, "Why have they stopped here? What are they waiting for?" Another student looked at the empty heavenly waterfall lake and said, "Could it be that Feng Xingjian has already cleared the third stage?" At the thought of this possibility, everyone fell silent. Norman threw a glance at Holt's furrowed brows and said with an awkward smile, "Look, aren't Lord James and the others waiting here? What does this mean?" This means that based on their judgment, Feng Xingjian has yet to clear this stage. That's why they're waiting here. The more he said, the clearer his thoughts became, and his tone became more and more confident. He continued to say, "What level is Lord James at? What sword arts cultivation does Master Hops have? Since they're waiting here, it must be because Feng Xingjian has yet to clear the third stage. That's why they're waiting here." His tone was filled with certainty, and everyone present nodded in agreement. However, just then, someone said in a soft voice, "Maybe they're waiting for Feng Xingjian to come back from the fourth stage." There's no one guarding the last stage in the Killing Techniques Palace. Norman glared at the person who had spoken and said, "You're talking about the headmaster from 2 generations ago, James. You're talking about the leader of the sword arts team, Hops, and so many teachers waiting here for a newbie like Feng Xingjian? Do you think that's possible?" The person who had spoken also felt that it was not very possible and scratched his head in embarrassment. However, Holt's expression was still a little gloomy. Hearing everyone's guesses, he could not help but say, "All right, let's not talk anymore. Let's just wait here." Therefore, everyone sat down cross-legged and started to wait. They were waiting for the possibility that even they did not know the outcome. Half an hour, 1 hour, about 1 hour and 15 minutes later, everyone's faces were filled with a trace of impatience. At this moment, from the direction of a small path on the opposite side of the heavenly waterfall lake, 4 figures slowly walked over. They were Feng Xingjian, Rhoda, and the 2 students who had led the way. James laughed out loud and led the others to welcome them. He asked with a hint of anticipation in his eyes, "Xingjian, you've passed the 4th stage in the Killing Techniques Palace?" Seeing the sudden appearance of such a large group of people, as well as the solemn-looking teachers standing before them, the 2 students became nervous. They had never seen such a big lineup before. Almost half of the leaders of the Sword Arts Department were standing before them. What situation was this? This was especially so for this old man who was unkempt and looked like a withered tree branch. Anyone who had participated in the regional selection and comprehended the Pantheon Monument would know that he was the Academy's headmaster from 2 generations ago. And for so many people to appear here, there was only one possibility: Feng Xingjian. The 2 of them turned to look at Feng Xingjian, their gazes filled with envy and jealousy. This was especially so for Fang Xingjian, who was only 17 years old. Right now, what everyone saw on his face was not youth and immaturity, but a bright future that shone brightly. Chapter 295. Looking ahead of Department James. Although Fang Xingjian felt that it was a little strange, he still nodded and said, "I've just learned the 4th stage's lightless sword." As he spoke, he activated the mountain shifting sword and pinched a stone spike in his hand. Then, with a sweep of the stone sword, the space within a range of 100 meters instantly darkened. It was as if the sun in the sky had been blocked by a thick layer of clouds. However, there were no clouds in the sky right now. This was not a natural phenomenon. It was because the lightless sword Fang Xingjian had activated had gathered the sun's divine light, gathering all the radiation from the sun within a range of 100 meters onto the longsword in his hand. The stone sword in his hand had turned into a white sword of light. Under the high temperature, it even continued to heat up the air, releasing hints of white steam. Seeing this scene, Head of Department James laughed out loud. His face, which was already filled with wrinkles, was now like an old piece of bark, filled with crisscrossing ravines. The eyes of the Sword Arts Master Hops, who was the leader of the Regional Academy's Sword Arts Research Group, also lit up. Excellent. Clearing the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day. Xingjian, what you've done today will definitely be recorded in history. It won't be long before your name is known throughout the world. The teachers at the side all wore gazes of great astonishment, envy, and admiration. Clearing the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day sounded very cool. However, only conferred knights like them, who had walked out of the Killing Techniques Palace, truly knew how difficult it was. This was not something that could be achieved just by saying it like a child. The amount of effort, hard work, preparation, talent, and foundation required was unimaginable. They suddenly thought of what Head of Department James had said earlier. When Fang Xingjian reached their age, what level would Fang Xingjian have reached? Holt, Norman, and the others, who had been standing in the distance, had unknowingly walked over and listened to the conversation between Fang Xingjian and the others. When they heard that Fang Xingjian had cleared the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day and learned the killing techniques in the 4 stages, their expressions were extremely interesting. Holt could not help but step forward. He stared into Fang Xingjian's eyes and asked, "Fang Xingjian, you've learned 4 sets of killing techniques in the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day?" Seeing that Fang Xingjian had nodded, Holt's tone was filled with doubt. "But learning 4 sets of killing techniques in a single day? I don't understand. How on earth did you do it?" Although Holt's sudden appearance was a little abrupt, his question was one that everyone present was curious about. Therefore, no one stopped him. Instead, all of them looked at Fang Xingjian, as if waiting for his answer. Fang Xingjian gave it some thought and said, "Xingjian's talent. I can pick up any sword technique just by looking at it a few times. I'm Xingjian. Killing techniques that Fang Xingjian saying, I Xingjian Fang Holt." Xingjian, Holt had thought of a bunch of theories and logic to refute Fang Xingjian's reply. If he could not refute Fang Xingjian, he could go back and try it out himself, then think of a way to surpass Fang Xingjian. However, Fang Xingjian's answer was so simple. To confer knights like them, who had been training hard day and night, wanted to learn killing techniques, synthesize killing techniques, make up for their weaknesses, and increase their abilities, Fang Xingjian's talent was like a cheat code. However, James immediately said in a deep voice, "All right, Xingjian, let's not talk about this anymore." He knew how much hatred Fang Xingjian's words would attract. If a bunch of people who had been cultivating sword arts for over 10 years or decades were to hear Fang Xingjian's words, they would be overwhelmed by jealousy and be so infuriated that they would vomit blood. Therefore, James said, "Also, don't spread what we've just said." Holt asked again, a little unwilling to give up, "What's the maximum level for your sword arts?" He stared at Fang Xingjian, as if he would charge up if Fang Xingjian did not answer this question. Right now, Fang Xingjian did not plan on hiding as much as he had done in the past. Right now, he had Terra Ingurgitation, Boundaries Negation, and 4 new killing techniques. He also had a level 29 superior divine armor protecting him. Therefore, he had fewer and fewer reservations. Moreover, he was still improving at an unbelievable speed. Therefore, he did not say much, but still said, usually it's around level 20 to 30. Hearing Feng Xingjian's words, Holt felt as if a rumble rang out in his mind, as if many thunderbolts had swept past him. Level 20 to 30? Holt's current highest sword technique was at level 20, which was already at the maximum level. Yet, Feng Xingjian was able to reach level 30 at the maximum? What kind of concept was this? What a terrifying talent. Everyone at the side also drew in a cold gasp. Usually, they would not even dare to think about a sword technique at the maximum level from level 20 to 30. People like Ronin and Duan, who had trained their sword arts to level 15, were already rare geniuses who could enter the regional academy and become conferred knights. Those who were slightly stronger, like Holt and the top 10 in the academy, would be able to push their techniques to around level 20. From this comparison, one could tell how astonishing Feng Xingjian's talent was. Moreover, he had reduced his level by 10. He had transitioned into a second transition job, the Heavenly Sword Sovereign, and his job specialty, the Heavenly Sword Imprint, was able to increase the maximum of his sword arts by 10 levels. James, the head of department, coughed and said, "All right, it's enough that everyone knows about this. Don't spread it out." With that, his gaze suddenly turned sharp. "If I hear any related news from the outside, don't blame me for being impolite." This was a gag order. No one was allowed to reveal any information regarding Feng Xingjian's sword arts levels. After saying a few words with a straight face, James smiled and looked at Feng Xingjian, saying, "Xingjian, the results you've achieved this time around have exceeded my expectations. Once the news of you clearing the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day spreads out, our Great Western Region Regional Academy will also be in the limelight. What request do you have? Tell me now. If I can make the decision, I'll definitely agree to it." Hops also said, "Xingjian, although you've rejected me twice, I still have to say that with your talent, it'll be a great waste if you don't join my sword arts team." Hearing that Feng Xingjian had rejected Hops twice, the expressions of the others became even more interesting. There were quite a few of them who had wanted to join Hops' team. However, right now, they could only look at Feng Xingjian with an envious gaze akin to that of a kitten or puppy. Hearing that, James also said solemnly, "Xingjian, there are still many benefits to joining Hops' team. You'll be able to obtain many of the most advanced information and theories there. If you're worried about wasting too much time, how about this? You can choose to accept the arrangements of a laboratory. If you have any other requests, just tell me. I'll definitely agree to them as long as it's within my capabilities." Hearing James' words, everyone present was astonished once again. However, this was just the beginning. Feng Xingjian gave it some thought and said, "I wish to participate in next year's national selection and get first place. I'll need the Academy's full support." Chapter 296. Hearing Feng Xingjian's words, everyone fell silent. Feng Xingjian had just been selected into the regional academy this year, but he was already thinking of participating in the next year's national selection. What would happen in the next year's national selection? That was a level 30 divine remains equipment that would also be treated as a reward, and it would affect the regional academy's budget. Countless experts of the new generation and old monsters would come forth to fight for the first place. How intense would the next year's national selection be? Even if one were to think with their toes, they would know that it would probably be the most intense national selection in decades. And to think that Feng Xingjian, a guy who had just become a conferred knight, was thinking of participating in the national selection 1 year later. When the people present heard Feng Xingjian's words, their first thought was that Feng Xingjian had gone mad. If he was not mad, then he was too arrogant, and did not know the immensity of heaven and earth. Holt, Norman, and the others looked at Feng Xingjian as if they were looking at a lunatic. Just as everyone thought that head of department James would refute Feng Xingjian's arrogant words, James said after some deliberation, "There's not much time left until next year's national selection. If I were to calculate it carefully, there's only a few days left, right? This year's national selection will also be very intense. Without being at the pinnacle of level 29, it'll be impossible for you to get into the top 10. Xinjiang, with your talent, you'll be able to accumulate your strength for another 4 years and participate in the next national selection. I guarantee that you'll be able to get first place in that year's national selection. However, Fang Xinjiang was unmoved, and Rhoda, who was at the side, was so anxious that her eyes were about to emit flames. Fang Xinjiang said, "I'll definitely participate in the next national selection, and I must get first place in it." James rolled his eyes. He had wanted to continue persuading Fang Xinjiang, but he suddenly thought of the mechanism of the national selection. He immediately smiled and said, "Xinjiang, it's not up to us to decide whether we can participate in the national selection or not. The purpose of the national selection is to select the top 10 existences. As long as you get into the top 10 of the academy, you'll have to participate in the national selection even if you don't want to. We'll naturally support the students who participate in the national selection." James's words were very clear. As long as Fang Xinjiang could enter the top 10 in the academy, he would naturally be able to participate in the national selection. They would also support Fang Xinjiang. Therefore, regardless of whether Fang Xinjiang's goal was the national selection or not, all he needed to do was to strengthen himself and defeat the students from the regional academy. Hops added, "Xinjiang, if you join my sword arts team, all the killing techniques and sword techniques we've collected will be open to you. You'll be able to ceaselessly cultivate sword techniques, synthesize them, and increase your abilities." Fang Xinjiang nodded and said, "If I can freely arrange my time after joining the group, then I will join." "Of course." Hop smiled. With the talent that Fang Xinjiang had displayed today, even if he were to just cultivate the sword techniques in the group, he would be able to greatly increase the progress of the entire group's research. It was because he was a very fast learner. Fang Xinjiang gave it some thought and then said to Head of Department James, "Recently, I'm going to publish a book, and I'm afraid that I'll encounter some policy restrictions. I hope that you can help me choose a side." Publishing a book? Publishing a book is a good thing. With your sword art standards, it's true that you can publish a book. It's fine. I'll help you personally. I also know many schools, so I'll get them to use your book for their lessons. Just as Fang Xinjiang, James, and Hops continued chatting and even started to talk about the research project, the people around them gradually realized that they were unable to understand what they were saying. Norman was not a sword cultivator to begin with, and as he listened to their conversation, the perplexity in his eyes grew. At the start, Holt tried his best to understand, but very soon he was unable to keep up with their train of thought. He slowly backed off and headed outside. Norman followed behind him and asked, "Aren't you going to listen to what they have to say?" "There's nothing good to listen to. I'm going to cultivate the Thunderbolt sword technique." Thinking of Fang Xinjiang's talent and learning speed, Holt felt an unprecedented sense of urgency. At the same time, an idea appeared in his mind. "If you're going to participate in next year's national selection, then I'm going to participate as well. Why should I, Holt, be inferior to you? Is it so great just because you're a little more talented?" Thinking of how Fang Xinjiang was being surrounded by Head of Department James, Head of Department Hops, and many other teachers, Holt's expression darkened even more. James continued, "Xinjiang, how about this? Since you've joined the sword arts team to research sword arts, then I'll have to give you some research funds. I'll give you 50,000 yuan first. Use it sparingly. When you come up with new results, I'll give you more money." A teacher could not help but say, "Head of Department, this year's budget has already been prepared. Where do we get the extra 50,000? Wouldn't we just have to squeeze a little?" James said, blowing on his beard, "With Xinjiang's talent, even if it's just the simple cultivation of killing techniques, he'll be able to get a lot of results. How can our academy not support such a talent? Calculate the money first. If it's not enough, I'll just ask Devitt Governor for more." Hearing Head of Department James's words, everyone present was secretly excited. This was the benefit of having a high seniority. A head of department like James, who could just barge into the governor's office to ask for money, was someone everyone would want to cozy up to. Thinking of the 50,000 gold, Fang Xingjian heaved a sigh of relief. With that, he was only halfway to the 100,000 gold required to cultivate the first level of the mystical prince. The few of them then discussed the specific arrangement for the research. Every week, Fang Xingjian would report to the sword tower where the sword arts team was located. He would be able to choose the projects that he was interested in to participate in, and he would also be able to freely read through the killing techniques that all the teams had collected. After the discussion, Fang Xingjian returned to the training room in the Sacred Land and continued his cultivation. The news of him clearing 4 stages in the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day should have gradually spread and started to spread. He believed that Ferdinand would make good use of the time to help him create hype and sell his books. Right now, he needed to make good use of the time to cultivate his sword arts. After all, he now had the 90,000 Godly Demon Flash, the Thunderbolt sword technique, the Mountain Shifting Sword, the Aquatic Sword Formation, and the Lightless Sword, a total of 5 killing techniques. He needed to work hard on cultivating all of them and synthesize them into his own sword techniques. At the very least, he would not lack killing techniques to cultivate for the next 1 or 2 months. First was the 90,000 Godly Demon Flash. Fang Xingjian worked hard on cultivating this set of sword technique, striving to bring it to the maximum level as soon as possible and then synthesize it into his current techniques. It was during these few days that Fang Xingjian had been cultivating that many peddlers pushing carts with books started to appear in the streets and alleys of the Great Western City. They would often appear outside the various academies, at the gates of the various aristocratic academies, dojos, and knight academies. Seeing the endless stream of knight apprentices coming and going, they would start selling their books loudly. In the north of the Great Western City, in a school known as the 5-Star Aristocratic Academy, which had a long history and had produced countless knights, Lilia was sweating profusely as she practiced her sword art seriously. Right now, Lilia was wearing a set of training clothes with short sleeves and shorts. She had a small and muscular figure, but she did not give off a scary feeling. Instead, coupled with her tan skin, cute face, and twin ponytails, she gave off a healthy and lively feeling. Moreover, her face was very beautiful and exquisite to begin with. As she trained in the training grounds, she attracted everyone's gazes. Chapter 297. Next to her, a young man waved a stack of papers in his hand and said with a smile, "Lilia, the new newspapers have arrived. Do you want to read them together?" Newspapers were also something that the second prince had recently started. Currently, they were only sold in the capital cities of the 8 major provinces. Due to the scarcity of newspapers, they were only available to the upper echelons of the nobility for the time being. Anyone who could get their hands on one would be able to use it to show off. However, Lilia did not even look at the young man as she continued to wield the sword in her hand and cultivate. That young man did not think much of it. He continued to circle around Lilia and said, "These newspapers are all about the major events that have happened in the empire." It said that the second prince has used his great skill of thoughts across 10,000 li to be able to transmit news quickly. Even if something were to happen in the Southern Flame region, we would be able to know immediately. Hearing the young man's words, Lilia exhaled, put down the big sword in her hand, and said, "Carter, I'm not interested in you. Stop pestering me." This youth by the name of Carter was also a knight apprentice of a 5-star aristocratic school. He was also the most outstanding knight apprentice in recent years. He had always been the king of popularity among the students. However, after Lilia arrived, he realized that Lilia was very different from the aristocratic ladies he knew in the past. He immediately became interested in Lilia. Hearing Lilia say this, Kite was not angry. He only smiled and said, "Lilia, I'll be participating in the prefectural selection next year and becoming a knight. You also know that I could have become a knight a long time ago. It's just that I wanted to accumulate my strength to fight for the prefectural champion, which is why I delayed it until this year." Lilia shook her head. Seeing that it was already late, she walked towards the school gate. Ever since Fang Xingjian had entered the regional academy, She had gotten her father to arrange for him to stay in this school in the Great Western region. She had even rented a room outside the school. Of course, Kai did not know so much. It was impossible for Lilia to directly tell him about her background, identity, and interpersonal relationships. Therefore, in Kite's eyes, Lilia was just a noble girl from a remote area, a rare woman. Seeing that Lilia had left, Kite chased after her and said, "Are you going home, Lilia? I'll send you back. The security in the Great Western region hasn't been very good recently." Seeing that Lilia was still ignoring him, Kite grinned and picked up the newspaper to read. "Oh, the Western Garrison Army chased after the people of Garcia, and I heard that they fought all the way to their own territory. Hee, to think that these black devils of Garcia would dare to come to the Empire and behave atrociously. What a bunch of fools. Oh, the Northern Ice Region's Rellings has come out from seclusion. He said that he will completely crush all the other contestants in next year's national selection, using overwhelming power to become the national champion." Kite said, "This Rellings is amazing. He's said to be the #1 genius in the Northern Ice region in the past 200 years, having been at second transition level 29 for over 10 years. It's said that even the Northern Ice region's governor isn't a match for him. TSK. If it wasn't because the conditions given to him by the Northern Ice region are too good, he would have gone to the Central a long time ago. However, the reward for the national selection this time around are too good, and Rellings is unable to reject them." Although Lilia did not have any feelings for Kite, she was quite curious about the contents of a newspaper when she heard him talking about the major events in the world. Kite stole a glance at Lilia and realized that Lilia was really listening. This time, he put in even more effort in reading. The famous sword of the Southeast, Sasa, has come, and he still wants to be a teacher in the regional academy? Kite's eyes lit up, and he said, "Sasa has the title of Sword Saint in the Eastern Sand region. To think that he has come to our regional academy as well? It'd be great if he could give me some guidance in sword arts in the future." As the two of them walked, Lilia did not say a single word. As Kite spoke, he gradually came to a stop. After all, he was still young and did not have much patience. He could not help but ask, "Lilia, what do I have to do for you to be willing to talk to me? Am I so detestable?" Lilia looked behind Kite, and when Kite saw her gaze, he could not help but turn around as well. He saw a bookseller pushing a cart and calling out his wares. The unrivaled genius Fong Xingjian cleared all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument in the regional selection, cleared 4 stages in the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day. Fong Xingjian's Sword Learning Secret Manual. Those who want it, come buy a copy. Don't miss this chance. If you miss out on Fong Xingjian's book on the secrets to becoming stronger, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. The peddler called out loudly, and many students were queuing up to buy the book. Kite frowned. This Fong Xingjian is too arrogant. He's publishing a book just like that? What unrivaled genius. Be careful not to become a laughing stock in the other regions. As a top student in his school, he instinctively despised other geniuses who were around the same age as him. He was also 17 years old, the same age as Fong Xingjian. This made him hate Fong Xingjian even more. However, Lilia smiled and said, "Then as long as you can clear all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument and clear the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day, I'll talk to you. To tell you the truth, the partner I want to find in the future is a genius like Fong Xingjian." Hearing Lilia's words, Kite was stunned. Regardless of whether it was the 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument or the fact that he had cleared the Killing Techniques Palace within a day, these were both extremely heavy achievements. Even many level 29 Confer Knights would not dare to think of such achievements, let alone Kite. It was possible for Kite to criticize Fong Xingjian, but it would be extremely difficult for him to do the same as Fong Xingjian. Kite was speechless and could only watch as Lilia happily ran off to buy books from the peddler. Kite let out a cold snort, crushed the newspaper in his hand, and went home angrily. His house was also located in the aristocratic district in the center of the great western city. The moment he entered the hall, he saw that his mother was already there waiting for him. When she saw him, she waved her hand and said, "Kite, come and meet your aunt and uncle." They come all the way from Harvest City. Aya, this must be Kite. He's so handsome. What's the use of looks? Kite's mother grinned and said, Who still looks at looks nowadays? Kite smiled and stood at the side, as if he was a statue waiting to be evaluated. He had long since gotten used to such conversations. That depends on one's abilities as well. Your Kite already has the ability to become a knight, right? When will he be participating in the prefectural selection? Next year. Every time this matter was brought up, Kite and his mother would have a hint of pride on their faces. This child could have passed the prefectural selection long ago. We were just worried that he was too young and did not know how to control himself. That's why we trained him for a few more years. Your Kite is really outstanding, unlike that son of mine who only knows how to fool around all day. I'll get him to come over and learn from Kite sometime. Kite appeared to be impatient, but in fact, every time he was praised by the elders, he could not help but feel a little proud. However, at the next moment, his aunt suddenly took out a book and said, Oh, right. This is a book I bought on my way here. It's said to be Feng Xinjian's biography, and it even has his sword art secrets. You know of Feng Xinjian, right? Chapter 298. How could I not know? This lad is amazing. Kite's mother seemed to have entered into gossipy mode. Not only did he solve all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries, I heard that he even cleared the Killing Techniques Palace within a day. Youngsters nowadays are really amazing. Right, is this his biography? That's right. I heard that Feng Xinjian wrote it himself. Not only did he talk about his experiences, but he also wrote down the secrets behind his cultivation. I bought 2 of them. One is for our silly son, and the other is for Kate. Thank you. When I heard that this was going to be published, I wanted to buy it. As she spoke, Kite's mother took the book and saw the words Secrets to Sword Training written on it. Kite's brows furrowed, and he could not help but say, This Feng Xinjian is only 17 years old, about the same age as me. How much content can there be in his biography? Kite, you're wrong to say this. Don't blame me for reprimanding you. Feng Xinjian is really capable and talented, Kite's aunt said. Do you know about the Pantheon Monument? That's something left behind by the divine level expert from 200 years ago, the melancholic monarch. 200 years have passed, and no one has been able to solve all 7 levels. Feng Xinjian is the first person to do so. And you guys know about the Killing Techniques Palace, right? That's so difficult. Back then, eldest brother took an entire year to clear the Killing Techniques Palace. I heard that even Governor Devitt took a month to clear it. Look at this Feng Xinjian. He managed to clear it within a day. It's really infuriating to compare oneself with others. In order to let more people understand the mysteries behind the 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument and how he had cleared the Killing Techniques Palace within a day, Ferdinand had added a lot of introductions to the Pantheon Monument and the Killing Techniques Palace. There was no other way about it. Many aristocrats who did not cultivate in martial arts or commoners of a lower class were not very clear about such high-level knowledge. In order to highlight how amazing Feng Xinjian was, Ferdinand had no choice but to explain in detail the existence of the Killing Techniques Palace and the unique characteristics of the Pantheon Monument. After reading it, everyone realized how heavy Feng Xinjian's achievement this time was. It could even be said to be frightening. Kite's mother stuffed a book into Kite's arms and said, Look, you're both 17 years old, but he has already become a conferred knight. What are you still doing? Take a good look at the book written by Feng Xinjian and learn the secrets within. Kite instantly felt an incomparable tightness in his chest. He only felt that the name Feng Xinjian was becoming more and more annoying. However, things did not change according to his will. He did not know if it was intentional or not, but the Second Prince's newspaper had also published the news that Feng Xinjian had cleared the Killing Techniques Palace within a day. This was like adding fuel to the fire. In this miracle world, which was equivalent to the Earth's Middle Ages, it was extremely difficult for ordinary people to send messages. Usually, only those pinnacle experts would be able to send messages across thousands of leagues. Moreover, they would be subjected to various restrictions. Therefore, the speed at which news was transmitted across the entire miracle world was not very fast. The newspaper that the Second Prince had created relied on his killing technique, thoughts across 10,000 lis, to easily transmit news across long distances. For example, this time around, the news of Fang Xingjian clearing the Killing Techniques Palace within a day had spread to the capitals of each of the 8 regions. This allowed Fang Xingjian's name to enter the sights of all of the empire's upper echelon. If all of the world's leaders were to read a newspaper, how great would the influence of that newspaper be? Right now, Fang Xingjian's fame was just that great. Moreover, he had solved all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries and cleared all 4 stages in the Killing Techniques Palace within a day. Either one of these 2 achievements was enough for one to boast about for the rest of his life. They were both extremely heavy and could attract the attention of anyone. Moreover, both of these achievements had appeared simultaneously on Fang Xingjian's shoulders. In a small alley in the Great Western City. This was the slum of the Great Western City's commoners. It was where countless refugees, gangs, and fugitives resided. In such a dark and dangerous street, an old granny was walking blindly. She wore clothes made of coarse cloth, and her face was covered by a veil. She looked just like an ordinary old granny from the commoners. Just as she was halfway there, a group of children suddenly dashed out with small knives in their hands. "Don't move. If you move again, I'll chop you to death." The children snatched away the old granny's basket and the food in it. Another child picked up a book from the basket and looked at the words "Secrets to Sword Training." However, he was illiterate and could not understand the contents of the book. The child said fiercely, "What book is this? Is it a secret manual for martial arts?" "This is not a secret manual." The old granny's hands were clenched tightly unknowingly, and there seemed to be a baleful aura circulating in her eyes. However, she still held it in and said, "This is Secrets to Sword Training, the book written by Fang Xingjian." When she said the words Fang Xingjian, the old granny's teeth seemed to be clenched tightly together, as if she was gnashing her teeth. If Fang Xingjian was here, he would definitely be able to recognize the old granny. She was Countess's aunt, Treja clan's Rebecca. Rebecca had escaped when Fang Xingjian was being surrounded and attacked. Later on, she was placed on the wanted list for treason. However, she was a level 19 knight, after all, and had managed to escape. She had even hidden in the Great Western City, plotting something. However, she could only disguise herself as an old granny from the commoners. She even had to put up with a bunch of kids who were only in their teens, not daring to lay a hand on them. To Rebecca, who had grown up in an aristocratic family, this was a great humiliation and agony. Every time this happened, she would hate Fang Xingjian even more. However, she still had to put up with it. If she were to take action here, she would be discovered immediately. How many conferred knights were there in the Great Western City? Any one of them would be able to crush her to death with a single finger. Therefore, she could only patiently explain, "It's just a storybook, not a secret manual." However, the eyes of the kid before her suddenly lit up, and he said, "It's this year's regional champion, Fang Xingjian, the genius who solved all 10 levels of the Saint's Monument's mysteries? I heard that he's also a commoner." Rebecca let out a breath and said, "It's not the Saint's Monument, it's the Pantheon Monument, and it's not the 10 levels of mysteries either." She lifted her head and looked at the kid before her, wondering why she was explaining all this to them. Therefore, she said, "It's him." The kid shoved the book into Rebecca's arms and said coldly, "Read it for us." Fury rose in Rebecca's heart, but she calmed down very quickly. She chuckled and said, "What's there to read about this book? The things written in it are all lies. Read it quickly." A few of the kids raised their knives, as if they would be able to stab Rebecca at the very next moment. There seemed to be a slight breeze blowing in the alley. It was the airflow brought about by the reduced force field. Rebecca let out a deep breath, but still took the book and started reading it. This is a letter written to all those who love sword arts, love knights, still have dreams, and are willing to fight for it. The beginning of the story is a place called the School of Sword Arts. Chapter 299. In the School of Sword Arts training grounds, Fang Xingjian sent Countess flying with a single sword strike. The latter's eyes rolled back, and he was so infuriated that he spat out 3 mouthfuls of blood. He fell to the ground and fainted from anger. Slander. All of this is blatant slander. As Rebecca read to this point, her hands were trembling from anger. The more she read, the angrier she got. However, the commoner kids at the side were all agitated. Good fight. Kill this Countess. If I were Feng Xingjian, I'd just take the opportunity to chop off his head. Idiot. Countess is an aristocrat. If he were to be killed, he wouldn't be able to participate in the prefectural selection. Unknowingly, over 10 commoners had gathered around Rebecca, listening to her read and tell the story. Seeing that Rebecca had stopped there, the leader of the kids immediately shouted, "Why did you stop? Tell me what happened next." Rebecca took in a deep breath and continued reading. Feng Xingjian defeated Countess with a single sword attack. In that instant, thunderous cheers broke out, and Vivian's face turned pale. Although Rebecca's face was rigid and she was expressionless throughout the story, as if she was reading a scripture, the story of the commoner young man with extraordinary talent, defeating the evil aristocrat, and moving forward was still very attractive to the commoners. As Rebecca continued to read, more and more people gathered around her. To the commoners who did not have televisions, telephones, or the internet, listening to the story and slowly bringing the protagonist into their own lives was a rare pastime. They clenched their fists tightly because of the first prince's appearance, looked worried because of Charlie's interrogation, and cheered loudly because of the governor's arrival. Charlie cried out, knelt on the ground, hugged Feng Xingjian's thigh, and cried out, "Xingjian, Lord Xingjian, please spare me. It's all the first prince's fault. I was blind. Please let me off." As she read these, the fury in Rebecca's heart gradually subsided, leaving behind only a cold smile. To her, the story in this biography was completely illogical and written randomly. How could Charlie possibly be as weak as he was described? However, the many people in the audience all cheered. Awesome. There are too many corrupt officials in the Empire's bureaucracy. This Charlie really deserves to die. Rebecca was no longer angry as she looked at these commoners. She just shook her head at their ignorance. However, this book had been edited by Ferdinand and the others. Be it Feng Xingjian or the other villains, it was more suitable for the people's tastes. More and more people gathered here, and Rebecca read faster and faster, wanting to finish reading as soon as possible. However, in the end, fury once again appeared in her eyes. Rebecca let out a cold laugh and said, "Feng Xingjian, this be **starred, has no sense of superiority or inferiority, and doesn't abide by the rules of morality. It doesn't matter if those Garcia's great warriors have escaped. The right thing to do is to surround Feng Xingjian." Just like that, in order to satisfy their own selfish desires, Countess, Rebecca, and the others disregarded the Empire's safety and let Garcia's destined warrior, Mamukia, escape. Slander. This is blatant slander. Halfway through reading, Rebecca stood up abruptly, her face filled with fury. It was as if she wanted to tear Feng Xingjian into pieces immediately. However, a strong man immediately snatched the book from her and said impatiently, "I've long since found an old hag like you reading too slowly. Let me read it instead." Rebecca was so infuriated that she could not react in time. However, she subconsciously held it in. After all, she was not allowed to make a move in the great western city. Moreover, she had held it in for half a year, and holding it in had become an instinct. That strong man did not know that he had just taken a stroll in hell. He picked up the book and continued reading. Rebecca and the others walked toward Feng Xingjian with a smug look on their faces. Feng Xingjian raised a sword and wanted to chase after Mamukia, but he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. He said furiously, "Rebecca, the country is in danger. How can you guys let Mamukia escape just because of a little bit of selfishness?" Countess laughed out loud. "Feng Xingjian, so what if we've let him escape? This day next year will be the anniversary of your death. You'd better worry about yourself." Rebecca laughed and said, "Be **starred, to think that you'd have such a day. Even if the country and its people are great, they're still not as great as me. Today, I'm going to skin you alive. No one can stop me." "Shut up. Rebecca let out an enraged bellow and snatched the book from the man's hands. With the story interrupted just as it was getting exciting, the people at the side immediately started scolding. A few of the triad members who had been happily listening to the story immediately stood up, wanting to head toward Rebecca and teach this old lady a lesson. A group of people surrounded her, as if they were going to wrap Rebecca up. However, at the next moment, with Rebecca as the center, a surge of power gushed out in all directions. Loud rumbling sounds rang out, followed by a series of sounds of tendons breaking and bones breaking. Then there were countless agonizing cries. The commoners in the surroundings had all been sent flying by Rebecca's reduced force field. With a furious bellow, she had already torn the book into pieces. She had only wanted to buy a book to see if Feng Xingjian had any secrets written in it. However, right now, she was enraged. To think that the biography is filled with nonsense and lies, completely slandering me. Feng Xingjian, the two of us are irreconcilable. Knowing that it was impossible for her to stay in the great western city after making a move, she soared up into the air and landed in another small alley, wanting to escape. However, she had not gone more than a few hundred meters when she heard a lady reading. Rebecca stood in the arena, her old face filled with intersecting wrinkles. She pointed at Feng Xingjian and scolded, "You little B****starred, how dare you try to harm Countess in the arena? Do you still have any respect for the law? Headmaster, this is the prefectural champion that you guys have taught? This little B****starred." Green veins popped up on Rebecca's forehead. She took a step forward and dashed out into the darkness, not wanting to hear this voice. However, after she made a few turns, someone else argued, "This Countess and Rebecca are really despicable. To think that they would betray the country and even poison Feng Xingjian for a little bit of selfishness." Thankfully, it didn't succeed. Haha. Thankfully, Countess was slashed to death by Feng Xingjian with a single sword attack, and Rebecca is now on the run. Evil has its retribution. Rebecca stomped on the ground, leaving behind a small pit. Her expression was savage, but she continued to advance, wanting to sneak out. She advanced carefully and finally did not meet with any more accidents. Based on her estimations, there should already be knights at the place where she had made her move. It's fine. Even if they find out, they won't know it's me for now, as long as I make good use of the time. Chapter 300. Just then, she saw a few children playing on the streets with wooden blades and swords. One of the children holding onto a sword said, "I'm Feng Xingjian." Another skinny and weak child, as well as a young fatso, said, "I'm Feng Xingjian." "I'm Feng Xingjian." "You're Countess." The child holding onto the sword pointed to the skinny boy and young fatso, saying, "You're Rebecca. Beat them up. Beat Countess to death. Beat Rebecca to death." Looking at this scene, Rebecca was so infuriated that she almost fainted. It could be imagined that, as a wanted criminal, it was impossible for Rebecca to retract her confession. Moreover, as Feng Xingjian's book continued to sell, more and more people would read this story. What was even more foreseeable was that as Feng Xingjian's reputation grew, this book would also become more and more famous, and more people would read it. Rebecca and Countess would probably be cursed for all eternity, going down in infamy for 10,000 years. Feng Xingjian, going down in infamy for 10,000 years. This was something that Rebecca had never thought of before. However, Feng Xingjian might really be able to write her name down in the annals of history. Infamy. This can't be. This definitely can't be. Rebecca clenched her teeth tightly. She was already someone who had one foot in her coffin. However, it was precisely because of this that she could not accept such a thing. Right now, she had temporarily put aside the matter of taking revenge on Feng Xingjian. All she could think of in her mind was how to stop the spread of this book. Therefore, she did not continue to flee outside. Instead, she took the risk and stayed behind. That night, a car belonging to a bookseller slowly drove up to the opposite side of Ferdinand's house. A middle-aged man with a face full of hardships was trembling all over. He spoke with a sobbing tone. "Sir, we've brought the place. It's right here." Ferdinand stays here? Rebecca was covered in a black robe, and her countenance was extremely cold as she said, "He's the one who's supplying the goods." "Yes, yes." Feeling the pressure on his body getting stronger, the man's heart beat faster and faster. "Sir, I'm just a bookseller. Please let me go. I don't know anything." "Booksellers?" Rebecca's expression was a little sinister as she said, "You are all helping the wicked. This is tampering with history." Under the pressure of the reduced force field, the middle-aged man's eyes started to roll back, and many marks of strangulation appeared on his neck. His head tilted to one side, and he was strangled to death by Rebecca. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly as she looked at the small villa before her. She had kidnapped a few booksellers before finding this place. Her main motive was to hold Ferdinand hostage and get him to buy back all the books that had not been sold. In her mind, Ferdinand and the others were at most level 19 knights. No matter what, they would not be able to match up to the battle prowess of an experienced level 19 knight like her. Moreover, the fact that she took action should have already been exposed. She did not know if the authorities had discovered that she was the one who took action. She had no more time to waste. "I'll buy back as many as I can. I must make good use of the time before the books are completely spread out." Just as Rebecca was thinking of this, she had already snuck into the darkness, slowly making her way toward the back door of Ferdinand's building. "Ferdinand, don't blame me. If you want to blame someone, blame yourself for standing on the wrong side. You guys want me to bear the infamy of 1,000 years. This is too much." Rebecca put her hand on the handle of the back door. Her reduced force field covered it bit by bit, and then with a little bit of force she pried open the lock. She slowly opened the door carefully, not daring to make any sound. Her reduced force field encompassed an area of 10 meters around her, freezing everything that she had noticed. This was all so that she would not make any sound. She knew that her abilities were above Ferdinand's, but the other party was not alone. They were all level 19 knights, and once the other party started to flee at full speed, it would be too disadvantageous for her if they were to give chase in the great western city. Therefore, she was extremely careful, taking one step at a time toward the house. Hearing the faint sounds coming from the hall, she slowly got closer to the hall. 5 meters, 4 meters, 3 meters, 2 meters. After turning the last corner, Rebecca dashed out fiercely. The thunder and fire sword cheese in her hands were about to burst out, and her reduced force field was fully encompassed. She had no intention of holding back at all. Other than Ferdinand, she wanted to kill everyone else she met. However, the moment she dashed out, she saw Fang Xingjian, Ferdinand, Anthony, and Robert sitting in the hall. There was also a very, very old man, whose face was filled with wrinkles and looked like a withered tree branch, also sitting in the hall. In the midst of her astonishment, the old man glanced at her and pressed his palm down lightly. Rebecca's entire body was slapped onto the ground like a large pancake. Her muscles and bones were in excruciating pain, and she was like a mosquito frozen in amber, unable to move at all. Head of Department James, who had casually pressed Rebecca onto the ground, smacked his lips and said, "Who is this old lady? She's quite fierce." Rebecca was using all of her strength to struggle crazily. Her expression was savage like that of a ferocious ghost, and she was indeed very fierce. Fang Xingjian threw a glance at her and said casually, "She's just a fugitive. I'll just hand her over to the city guards institution later." James did not think much of a woman who was at the level of a knight. He let her go and continued the discussion. It's no wonder that you want to challenge the Killing Techniques Palace. Now that you've made a name for yourself, it'll be easy for your book to sell. But looking at the contents of this book isn't sold to experts," Ferdinand said, feeling embarrassed. "It's purely for the sake of earning money and selling it to ordinary people. We'll continue to publish books that are meant for knights in the future." James grinned and said, "It won't be a storybook again, right?" Ferdinand also smiled. "It'll be a book that teaches sword arts. But we'll continue to publish storybooks as well. They're selling quite well." James asked nonchalantly, "How much did you sell them for?" All the books he had read before were all boring stories, and to him, there was no substance to them. However, There were a few new sword arts that he found to be quite good. Moreover, each book was sold for 50 copper coins. To him, such a cheap thing would not be able to sell for much money. Ferdinand shook his head and said, "We started the publicity a week ago, and up till now, we've sold a total of 30,000 books. That's 150 gold. How many days has it only been? It's a pity that pirated versions have started to appear. There are already people in the suburbs who are copying our books and selling them. Head of department, James, can you do something about this? Copying books and selling them? That's right. Those people use the worst quality toilet paper to copy our books. Then we sell them for 50 copper coins, while they sell them for 25 copper coins. Basically, half of the market has been snatched up by them. Sir, think about it. There are so many villages near the great western city, as well as several tens of towns. There are millions of people. Even if only 10% of them buy our books, it'll be worth several thousand gold coins. If we were to spread them across the entire country, it'd be worth at least several 100,000 or even millions." James's eyes flickered slightly as he said, "I can only control the area within the great western region at most." Ferdinand smiled and said, "That's enough." Chapter 301. Right now, with the Empire's management of books, all martial techniques, especially nurturing techniques, training techniques, amassing techniques, and killing techniques, were under very strict control. Other than schools and factions, anyone who casually disseminated them would be severely punished. For things like Feng Xinjian's biographies and storybooks, there were no related legal provisions at all, nor was there any concept of copyright. Basically, no one would care if one were to casually copy or sell them after buying them. Even head of department James would not be able to create a concept of piracy and set up a copyright law. There would be too many obstacles in the way. Even with his background and reputation, it was impossible for him to do so, and there was no need for it. What he needed to do was to submit Feng Xinjian's Secrets to Sword Arts to be included in the category of sword arts secret manuals. This would make things easier to handle, and it would be protected like other secret manuals. No one would be able to casually pirate or disseminate it. Of course, with James' reputation, such secret manuals could only be submitted to the Great Western Region's regional government. It would be too difficult and costly to get the central government to approve it. Therefore, James said that he could only control the books within the Great Western Region. James then smiled and said, "If I were to submit Secrets to Sword Arts, then as my personal representative, you wouldn't be able to casually sell it either." However, Ferdinand was prepared for this. He smiled and said, "Isn't this what Lord James came here to discuss with me?" Knowing that Feng Xinjian would look for James for help, Ferdinand had already expected this. He continued, "Let us sell our books under the Regional Academy's Sword Arts Department. I can give you 5% of the profits." James' countenance did not change as he said, 20%. Ferdinand smiled and leaned back on the sofa. He looked at Feng Xinjian, who was cultivating with his eyes closed. "Xinjian, how much did you say?" In an instant, James' aura weakened. There was no other way. Feng Xinjian was too important to him now. With a genius like Feng Xinjian with such talent and character, there were only two ways he could make him stay. One was to use forceful methods like the First Prince, and the other was to try his best to go along with Feng Xinjian's wishes. And Ferdinand had a good grasp of this point. Head of department James glared fiercely at Ferdinand, exhaled, and said, "All right, give me another price. It can't be 5%. If I report this to the department, everyone will gossip." Ferdinand nodded and said, "Then we'll both take a step back. 10%. James still wanted a bargain, but after giving it some thought, he felt that as the governor from 2 generations ago, he should not waste his face on something like this. Therefore, the matter was settled just like that. Ferdinand, Robert, and Anthony would all be listed under the Regional Academy. The Secrets to Sword Arts would also be listed under the Regional Academy, and they would be sold as sword arts manuals in the Regional Academy. They would also be given 10% of the profits. With the support of the state government, more than 99% of the pirated goods would gradually disappear. James shook his head, looked at Feng Xinjian, and said, "Xinjian, in the future, you should publish fewer of these books. If you want to earn money, you can publish some sword arts cultivation teaching materials. With your cultivation, night-level teaching materials will definitely be easy to get. On the ground, Rebecca's body gradually stopped struggling. It was because she had already figured out James' identity from their earlier conversation. The Regional Academy's headmaster from 2 generations ago, the Great Western Region's governor, and a level 29 pinnacle conferred knight. He was not someone she could go up against. What made her feel even more despair and hatred was the other content of their conversation. To think that the book's Secrets to Sword Arts would be listed under the Regional Academy. It had suddenly taken on an official status, and it was just like a school's teaching material. How many private knight academies, factions, as well as aristocrats and commoners would buy this book? When people saw that this book was published by the Regional Academy, it was even more impossible for them to doubt its authenticity. Everything in the book would be decided at this moment. Rebecca's name was destined to be recorded in history, and she would be cursed for all eternity. Thinking of this, Rebecca's eyes turned red, and her heartbeat and blood flow sped up. She opened her mouth, wanting to shout out, but James slammed her onto the ground, making her unable to say a word. However, this also made James remember her existence once again. Oh, there's such a person. He casually snapped his fingers, sending out a sound from his reduced force field. Not long later, 2 knights walked in. Take this. Anthony, who was at the side, added, Rebecca, Tresia clan's Rebecca. He looked at Rebecca with a gaze that was filled with sorrow. Once upon a time, when he was still in Cursed Academy, he had to be very respectful when facing this Tresia clan's elder, not daring to defy him in the slightest. However, right now, the other party was already groveling before him. Although it was not because of him, it still made him feel very emotional. When James heard Rebecca's name, with a wave of his hand, he grabbed Rebecca across space. His strength attribute was more than 10 times higher than Rebecca's, and even though he was using his reduced force field to grab her across space, Rebecca was unable to move at all. Rebecca still wanted to shout out, but James only used a little force to break her throat, and she could only let out hoarse cries of agony. James was trying to force Rebecca to her death. Although no one would believe Rebecca, even if she were to shout out loud, James clearly wanted to resolve this matter in a simpler way. He threw Rebecca a look of slight disdain and said calmly, So you're that Rebecca? Take her away. That look of disdain made Rebecca extremely furious. The 2 knights at the side carried Rebecca away. When they heard Rebecca's name, their gazes toward this old lady were filled with hints of disdain. With that, the matter regarding the books would be settled. There were several tens of millions of people in the Great Western region. With the Regional Academy's influence, they would be able to sell a huge amount of books and provide Feng Xinjian with a great amount of wealth. However, all of this would still require time. Feng Xinjian and James left this place and headed back to the academy. James said, The matter regarding the books will be settled very soon. After they're registered under the Regional Academy's name, there won't be many people who would dare to lay their hands on the 3 of them. What are your plans from now on? I want to first cultivate the Killing Techniques Palace's sword techniques and the 90,000 Godly Demon Flash to perfection. Oh, I wonder if you or Lord Hops would be able to spare some time to spar with me. Compared to cultivating alone, sparring with experts in the Sacred Land with 100 times the speed was clearly a much faster method. Hearing Feng Xinjian's question, a strange expression appeared on James' face. You're really ambitious to want 2 level 29 experts to spar with you. Chapter 302. Faced with Feng Xinjian's request, Head of Department James shook his head and said, Hops will definitely not agree. He doesn't even have enough time to study sword arts. How can he possibly train with you? Then what about you? There shouldn't be a problem. Oh, James grinned and said, You should know what I want, right? Of course, Feng Xinjian knew what James wanted. The reason why James had been able to guard the Pantheon Monument for decades was because of the profoundness of the Pantheon Monument. Feng Xinjian weighed the pros and cons before saying, I can split the 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries into 7 parts, and give them to you. With 7 levels of profoundness, there would naturally be 7 versions and a total of 6 evolutions. Feng Xingjian could provide it to Feng Xingjian time and time again, in exchange for Feng Xingjian's help. However, of course, James did not agree to 7 times. He tried to negotiate. 7 times is too much. How about you give me the first 3 levels of profoundness? The first and second levels will definitely be too easy for me. Right now, James was looking at Feng Xingjian with gleaming eyes. In his eyes, Feng Xingjian was like the most delicious cake in the world. Feng Xingjian said directly, "Between the heavens and earth, strength rules. Between the heavens and earth, the stars rule. I'll split it into 7 parts. I'll give it to you one by one. If you don't want it, then forget it." James stared at Feng Xingjian hungrily. He was so anxious that he scratched his ears and cheeks. The thing he had been pursuing for most of his life was right in front of him, and even he felt a little impatient. He immediately said, all right. 7 times it is then. Tell me quickly. Therefore, on their way back, Feng Xingjian slowly explained the first level of profoundness of the Pantheon Monument to James. When the two of them returned to the academy, James let out a sigh of relief. His entire temperament seemed to have changed. He sighed and said, "Waves? To think that it's waves? To think that the ultimate profoundness of the Pantheon Monument is waves. It's a pity." However, he soon shook his head. If I had gotten my hands on this waves 20 years ago, no, even if I'd gotten my hands on it 10 years ago, I would probably have switched to it. However, it's too late now. Feng Xingjian was puzzled. "You said, we won't make in time?" James smiled and said, "I only have a few years left to live." Although he was talking about a very serious topic, his expression was extremely carefree. "But before I die, I've finally been able to unravel the profoundness of the Pantheon Monument. To be able to see a genius like you appear out of nowhere, I can die with no regrets." Feng Xingjian asked, "Is there no way for an expert like you to extend his life?" Life extension. Haha, when you're at level 25 and your ether synchronization rate has reached 60% or above, you'll be able to sense the minute structure of your body and see the little worms that make up your body. At that time, you'll be able to adjust your body structure. Every level 25 conferred knight will be able to live up to 120 years old, and their physical strength will not deteriorate in the slightest, and they will be immune to all diseases. When you're at level 29 and your ether synchronization rate has reached 100%, you'll be able to sense time and space, truly stopping and slowing down the aging of your body. However, even so, you'll only be able to extend your lifespan to 150 years old. Of course, regardless of whether you're 120 or 150 years old, until the moment before your death, conferred knights won't fall sick, age, and their abilities won't deteriorate. They'll only truly die at the moment of their death. Feng Xingjian's eyes shone with a strange glow, as if he was considering if he could extend his lifespan after reaching level 25 and 29, or if he would still only have 5 years of lifespan after reaching level 29. No, now, he should only have 3.5 years left. He then asked, "Then what about the divine level?" Divine level? I don't know. It said that they can live up to 180 or 200 years. James shook his head and said, "They can destroy cities, annihilate countries, and kill up to 10,000 people with a single thought. However, in the end, they won't be able to escape the limitations of their lifespans." Feng Xingjian did not reply to this question, and James did not seem to be willing to continue discussing this heavy topic either. He said directly, "Let's go to your training room and start cultivating now." Both of them were conferred knights who had surpassed the limits of humans, and things like sleep were no longer essential to them. They could cultivate at any time, and there would be no danger even if it was day or night. Therefore, the two of them went to Feng Xingjian's training room. Taking a deep breath and sensing the endless flow of information into his brain, Feng Xingjian felt that his powers seemed to have increased a little. Opposite him, James casually drew out a wooden training sword and asked, "What sword technique are you cultivating now?" 90,000 godly demon flash. Feng Xingjian also drew out a wooden sword and asked, "You know it, right?" James laughed out loud. There aren't many sword techniques in the regional academy that I don't know. As he spoke, his body swayed slightly, and over 100 silhouettes leaped out from his body. Bringing about strong gales, they turned into a sword formation and dashed out toward Feng Xingjian. On the other side, Feng Xingjian's body trembled slightly, and over 100 godly demon clones also flew out. They pierced forward like a military formation, clashing against James's clones. Thud, 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 thud. Chaotic sounds kept ringing out from the training room. This can't do. The exchange of ether particles is too slow. You must learn to think from another perspective. Every doppelganger needs to use a different sword art. Don't keep on killing each other. Pay attention to the light and shadows. In the fight between the two of them, James obviously had the upper hand. Regardless of whether it was his ether synchronization rate, his 5 attributes, or the support from his various specialties, all of them made his 90,000 godly demon flash extremely powerful. As the fight continued, James also continued to guide Feng Xingjian. Of course, it was better to have someone guiding him than to work behind closed doors. It was just like how, in university, one would either have to learn by themselves or listen to the lectures of the teachers in class. Of course, the efficiency would be higher if one listened to the explanations of the teachers. Learning had always been the easiest, fastest, and most effective way to improve. It was the same for Feng Xingjian when learning sword techniques. There were secrets and principles that had been researched by predecessors. Of course, it would be faster for someone to tell him directly than for him to comprehend them himself. It was just that the sword techniques he had learned in the past were too simple, and the teacher's standards were not as high as James. Therefore, Feng Xingjian could just learn them by himself. Right now, under James' guidance, Feng Xingjian felt like a fish in water, and his sword arts level was improving at a rapid rate. However, he did not know that James was even more astonished than him. It was because James realized that none of the problems he had raised were raised a second time. This meant that no matter what flaws he raised, Feng Xingjian would be able to correct them immediately and not make the same mistakes again. Such an effect was great for both parties. Regardless of whether it was the person teaching or the person learning, they could feel the feeling of immediately correcting a mistake or flaw and then improving. This sense of achievement was unparalleled. Therefore, the more James taught, the more excited he became. The two of them taught, practiced, ate, and drank. In the blink of an eye, an entire night passed. Right now, in the training room, several hundred clones were attacking James crazily. Each clone seemed to have a physical form, bringing along light and shadows, bringing about air currents, and even performing various different sword techniques. James's godly demon clones were almost completely suppressed, unable to counterattack. Finally, Feng Xingjian let out a long roar, and another 200 clones split out from his body. A total of several hundred clones almost filled up the entire training room. However, at the next moment, they disappeared one by one. In the end, only Feng Xingjian's original body was left standing, his eyes closed tightly as he slowly recalled the feeling from earlier. After a night of hard training, with James' help, his cultivation speed had increased by at least 3 to 4 times. He had directly trained the 90,000 godly demon flash to the maximum level of level 40 and was able to create a total of 501 godly demon clones. Chapter 303. In the following days, Feng Xingjian spent almost all of his time with James, wholeheartedly cultivating his sword arts. With James, his best teacher, around him, his sword arts cultivation speed had almost reached the limits of his current state. In fact, if the people in the Great Western region were to find out that James was accompanying Feng Xingjian in his sword arts cultivation every day, 99% or more of them would probably be extremely envious and jealous of him. Right now, Feng Xingjian had the support of the 4 specialties of Genius Sword Arts, Sword Specialist, Unparalleled Sword Intent, and Darkness Sword Sense, as well as the strengthening of the ether particles density by 100 times. There was also Feng Xingjian, who had the world's best sword arts talent, and James, a level 29 conferred knight, the regional academy's headmaster from 2 generations ago, as well as the Great Western Region's governor's guidance. Fang Xingjian's sword arts cultivation speed had improved by leaps and bounds. Moreover, he had such an ultimate teacher. He could learn the 90,000 godly demon flash at any time, and he could even consult James on the secrets to synthesizing techniques. Of course, there were secrets to synthesizing techniques as well. Apart from the unexpected success rate of ether synchronization, being able to extract the essence of 2 techniques and better control one's thoughts during the synthesis would also slightly increase the success rate. Within a few days, Fang Xingjian had cultivated the 90,000 godly demon flash to the maximum 5 times. He had also synthesized 5 techniques consecutively, and finally succeeded in synthesizing the 90,000 godly demon flash into the luminous heaven soaring slash. In the training room, a light sword condensed in Fang Xingjian's hand. With a slash, a gush of scorching heat gushed forth, and wherever the light sword passed by, the ground would be charred black. Fang Xingjian then clenched his fist slightly, and the light sword turned from white to blue. He slashed out once again, and in that instant he could feel a gush of cold air gushing forth, freezing the ground into a large area of frost. A satisfied smile broke out on Fang Xingjian's face. Then the light sword in his hand swelled up, as if it had turned into a myriad of light shadows in that instant, encompassing him. James's gaze narrowed as he said, "Supreme Mistwind Sword plus Radiant Light Sword Technique plus 90,000 Godly Demon Flash. Is it the Zenith Light Sword Formation?" Clearly, someone had already researched the synthesis formula for these 3 sets of sword techniques. James then said, "The clone effect of the 90,000 Godly Demon Flash has been condensed, turning into one sword into many swords. It can now be used to condense sword formations. Try out its prowess." Therefore, the luminous heaven soaring slash turned into the zenith light sword formation, allowing him to perform wave light swords with temperatures ranging from -100 degrees Celsius to -2,000 degrees Celsius. He could also condense light swords and set up a light sword formation, increasing Fang Xingjian's abilities once again. Moreover, Fang Xingjian's zenith light sword formation was at level 40. Both the prowess of the wave light swords and the prowess of the sword formation far surpassed that of an ordinary zenith light sword formation. The Fang Xingjian's sword light sword formation was level 40. And 2. The sword of the Xingjian's light Xingjian. With a single thought from Fang Xingjian, streams of light swords shot out from the light spheres, hitting the ground. In that instant, large areas of charred or frosted ground were formed. Fang Xingjian then put his palms together and clenched his fingers tightly. The light swords shot out from the 6 light spheres instantly merged together, and a light pillar swept out toward the ground. Under the continuous heat, the ground started to melt and crystallize. However, this was just an experiment. The light swords retracted upon contact. Fang Xingjian had already ended the zenith light sword formation. James nodded incessantly and said, "The prowess of your zenith light sword formation far surpasses that of your peers. Moreover, these 3 sets of sword techniques are already very powerful synthesis formulas. For the synthesis of the 4th and 5th sword techniques, the known synthesis formulas are getting fewer and fewer." As he spoke, his tone became excited. "If you choose sword techniques that have not been synthesized before, you'll be able to discover new formulas." Right now, Fang Xingjian had become a great treasure in James' eyes. After the guidance he had received over the past few days, he had completely understood how terrifying Fang Xingjian's talent was. Like everyone else, he had thought that Fang Xingjian was arrogant and too young when he said that he would become the national champion in a year's time. But now, he felt that it was not impossible. He seemed to be anticipating the astonishment everyone would see when Fang Xingjian participated in the national selection. Hearing James' words, Fang Xingjian shook his head slightly and said, "I plan to cultivate the 4 sets of sword techniques from the Killing Techniques Palace and synthesize them." The synthesis formulas for the 4 sets of sword techniques from the Killing Techniques Palace had been researched and explored by several generations of governors. It could be said that they had been thoroughly tempered. After synthesizing the 4 sets of sword techniques, one would be able to obtain an ultimate killing technique, the prodigious demolition sword. It was a set of sword techniques that had been created for the sake of destruction and destruction. Hearing Feng Xingjian's thoughts, James nodded repeatedly. His mind was already spinning. If he were to synthesize the prodigious demolition sword and the zenith light sword formation, no one had figured out what kind of sword technique they would synthesize, right? There were far too many sword techniques and killing techniques in this world. The greater the number of types and the various combinations, there were far too many formulas waiting for people to discover. James started to look forward to the results of the synthesis of the prodigious demolition sword and the zenith light sword formation. His prodigious demolition sword had long since reached the maximum level. However, if he were to cultivate and synthesize the zenith light sword formation to the maximum level, it would probably take him at least 1 to 2 years. During this period of time, he would not have the time to cultivate his original martial techniques. There were thousands of such synthesizations, so even he would not be able to explore them one by one. James was secretly excited. If I were to come up with a cultivation method for such a sword technique, it would be sufficient for me to report it to the Central and reach the Knight Association Sword Art Shrine. The Sword Art Shrine was the greatest glory for the Empire's sword arts. Only sword techniques that were deemed to be extremely powerful would be recorded in the Sword Art Shrine and receive endless glory. It was also a sword technique that the leaders of all influences would fight to purchase. At the thought of this, James found Feng Xingjian to be increasingly pleasing to the eye. At the thought that there might be a sword technique in the Great Western Region's Regional Academy that could be recorded in the Sword Art Shrine while Feng Xingjian was still alive, he could not hold back his agitation. However, Feng Xingjian suddenly sat down, giving James a fright. "What's wrong with you?" Feng Xingjian said calmly. "The ether synchronization rate has reached 20%. The second stage of the 10 heavenly barriers seems to be coming." Simultaneously, after Feng Xingjian's first month in the Regional Academy had passed, his rebirth sword technique had also been reported to the Central and was preparing to be approved by the Knight Association. At the end of that month, the rebirth sword technique appeared in the Knight's Handbook and was then distributed to the various academies, factions, and departments. However, people's evaluations of the rebirth sword technique were mixed. Potential 5,000. Has this author gone crazy? Has he gone crazy from thinking about money? Nonsense. How could there possibly be such a strong effect? But Hobson was the one who approved it. Tommy, get a new student to cultivate this sword technique. In the academy in Cursed, Headmaster Jackson also flipped open this issue of the Knight's Handbook. He looked at the rebirth sword technique and shook his head. He's in too much of a rush. In his opinion, Feng Xingjian was still in too much of a rush. It had not been long since he became a conferred knight, but he had already created his own nurturing technique. However, after a moment of silence, Jackson still said, "After all, he's someone from our academy. We have to help him. Victor, get a student to try cultivating this rebirth sword technique." Chapter 304. In the training room, Feng Xingjian looked at his stats window. His ether synchronization rate had already reached 20%. James, who was at the side, was shocked when he heard what he said. 20%? Didn't you just transition less than a month ago? How did you improve so quickly? With that, he carried Feng Xingjian and said, "Hang on. You can't clear the 10 heavenly barriers in the sacred land with a density of 100 times. The 10 heavenly barriers refer to the fact that with every 10% increase in ether synchronization rate, one would receive more information. The human body's senses would go through a qualitative change, and when faced with such a change, one would need a strong will and mental strength to overcome it. For such a barrier, the environment was very important. The sacred land with a density of 100 times was usually a sacred land for cultivation, but during the heavenly tribulation, it would become a complete hell. 100 times the amount of information became the best bullet for the 10 heavenly barriers, and it could turn a conferred knight into a fool. Therefore, James panicked. Carrying Feng Xingjian, he soared up into the sky, wanting to escape. With a loud boom, the entire house was blasted by his reduced force field, turning into fragments on the ground. And before it completely exploded, James had already soared up into the sky. Feng Xingjian was a genius that would not be seen in 100 years, no, 1,000 years, and he had even solved the mysteries behind the Pantheon Monument. Moreover, James had only obtained the first level yesterday. How could he possibly allow Feng Xingjian to fall here? He continued to accelerate, dashing up into the sky like a meteor. I was too careless, too careless. Not only does Feng Xingjian have great sword arts talent, but his ether synchronization rate has also increased so quickly. The success rate of clearing the 10 heavenly barriers in the sacred land is too low. I wonder if Xingjian, just as James was thinking about this, Feng Xingjian's voice rang out. There's no need to fly anymore. I'm fine. Fine? James looked at Feng Xingjian with wide eyes and asked, Are you sure you're fine? The 20% heavenly barrier should be an emotional shock, right? Emotional shock? Feng Xingjian blinked and said, I seem to be able to see many emotions. Your nervousness, mine? Feng Xingjian was stunned for a moment, then realized that he had pitifully little emotions. The human brain is also made up of ether particles, and it constantly emits waves. If one can collect the information of the waves, they'll be able to understand a person's emotions. James looked at Feng Xingjian in surprise. You've already cleared this heavenly barrier? The waves in his heart were far greater than what he had shown. 10 heavenly barriers, 10 heavenly barriers. Just from the name alone, one could tell how terrified the conferred knights were toward the stages of ether synchronization rate. It was because the difficulty was too great. However, right now, Feng Xingjian had actually managed to barge out from the sacred land where the density was 100 times, and he had even passed the heavenly barrier without making a sound. This made Xingjian's James and Saint. Xingjian, Wang, James, and James. Feng. Son James. Window, of course, it was still unrealistic for him to get first place. The competition was too intense, and a year's time was still too short. However, Feng Xingjian kept on looking at James and then at himself. In his mind's vision, there were more things in the world 10 meters around him. They were some indescribable colors. He couldn't tell what these colors were because they couldn't see light, so naturally, he couldn't tell what color they were. However, through his heaven's perception, Feng Xingjian could see them. He could not tell what their colors were, but he knew what each of them represented. This was fury, and this was nervousness. Was this happiness? He looked at James, at the myriad of emotions, and then turned to look at himself. However, he realized that he was almost completely blank. There were only lumps of fury and vengeance gathered in his heart, as if they were going to explode at any moment. Is this the result of taking away my love, kinship, and friendship? Fury and vengeance. Once they accumulate to a certain extent, they'll need to explode? Feng Xingjian clenched his fists and said, With a synchronization rate of 20%, I should be able to level up to 21% now, right? Can you provide some ferocious beast for me to kill? Of course, that's not a problem. However, you'll have to take note in the future. The next time your synchronization rate reaches 29%, don't stay in the sacred land to cultivate. It's too risky to cultivate in the sacred land where the density is 100 times higher. Feng Xingjian nodded, but he did not mind it. It was because when he first entered the sacred land where the density was 100 times higher, he had already understood that his brain far surpassed that of ordinary people. Ordinary information impacts would not be able to harm him. Moreover, time was tight for him now. It would be too much of a waste of time to give up on the 100 times higher density and slowly grind away the last 1% synchronization rate. Simultaneously, in the Northern Ice Region's Regional Academy, in the sacred land where the density was 120 times higher, a man with a face full of bushy beard, looking like a savage, was reading a book. Next to him, a student said, Brother Rellings, hee. The moment you came out from your seclusion, the headmaster handed you the task of reviewing the Knight's Handbook. It seems that he really hopes that you will stay in the Northern Ice region and inherit his legacy. The man who was called Rellings shook his head and said with indifference, "Dragons don't coexist with snakes. There's no need for the strong to accommodate the weak. Moreover, when a conferred knight reaches level 25, their body structure is no longer related to that of ordinary people. At level 29, the difference between them and ordinary people is like that of a completely different species. To ordinary people, we're like gods high up in the sky. Gods shouldn't accommodate ordinary people and work hard for the sake of ordinary people's futures. The headmaster still doesn't understand this. That's why he stopped at level 29. Now that we have the abilities of a god, we must also have the spirit of a god. Only when the spirit and the body are compatible will we be able to strive for the divine level. However, each issue of the Knight's Handbook gathers the most cutting-edge information in the Empire's martial arts. It's really good stuff. There's still 11 more months before the start of the national selection. If I can keep on reading the Knight's Handbook like this, it'll be of great help to me." The other students could only look at Rellings with envious gazes. The Knight's Handbook published by the association every month gathered the research results of various geniuses in the Empire. Not everyone had the right to read it. He then said, "I heard that a genius has appeared in the Great Western region recently. He's called Fang Xingjian or something. He's extremely arrogant and brags so much that he's even saying that he'll be able to clear the Sword Arts Department's Killing Techniques Palace within a day. Isn't he afraid that he'll bite his own tongue?" "Oh, Fang Xingjian?" Rellings seemed to be recalling something and said, "That Fang Xingjian who solved all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries." "That's right, that's him. It's true that the 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries are very powerful. But to say that he'll be able to clear the Killing Techniques Palace within a day, I think they're just going easy on him." It was true that there were many knights and conferred knights who had bragged about their abilities in history. To this student, it was the same for Fang Xingjian. However, Rellings shook his head and said, "Hops from the Great Western region is a character. He's very serious when it comes to sword arts research and wouldn't resort to such trickery. Even if he doesn't do it, other people can do it." Rellings did not comment on this, but his gaze, which was looking at the Knight's Handbook, suddenly narrowed as he said, "What a coincidence. This Fang Xingjian's self-created sword technique has been included in this issue of the Knight's Handbook." "It's been included in the Knight's Handbook? What sword technique is it?" Let me take a look. It's a nurturing sword technique? It doesn't look like much. Wait a minute. Chapter 305. Under the astonished gazes of the other students, Rellings fell completely silent, looking at the Knight's Handbook in a daze. When the other students saw this scene, they scratched their heads out of curiosity, wanting to snatch the handbook to take a look. However, they did not dare to do so. It was because they knew that every time Rellings entered this state, it meant that he had comprehended something. If they were to disturb him at this moment, they would be chopped up into minced meat. About half an hour later, Rellings lifted his head, let out a deep breath, and said slowly, "Amazing." "Amazing? What's amazing?" "This Fang Xingjian is amazing, very amazing," Rellings said. "This rebirth sword technique is very good and has given me a lot of inspiration. I'm going to go into seclusion. I feel that my saber arts will be able to improve again." "That's right, but brother, you just came out from seclusion." Rellings had already turned to leave. He said calmly, "Get the headmaster to send someone to cultivate this rebirth sword technique. Also, send an invitation letter to the Great Western region and think of a way to invite Fang Xingjian over. I have many things that I wish to communicate with him about." "Huh? The Great Western region is so far away. How could he possibly come over for no reason?" "That's something you guys have to consider. In any case, try your best to invite him over. You can't possibly ask me to go over, right?" Within a short half a month, countless influences have been shocked by the rebirth sword technique that Fang Xingjian had written in the Knight's Handbook. However, the results were all mixed. Some people felt that Fang Xingjian was arrogant and ignorant, thinking that 5,000 potential points was nothing to scoff at. Of course, there are also people who supported Feng Xingjian. The evidence for their support was Hop's review, as well as Feng Xingjian's own achievement of breaking through all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument and clearing the Killing Techniques Palace in a single day. If one wished for others to believe in him, one would need to accumulate experience step by step. If Feng Xingjian had been a nameless person in the past, even if most people saw the rebirth sword technique, they would probably just ignore it and not look at it at all. And now, with the sword arts expert Hops supporting Feng Xingjian, in addition to Feng Xingjian's 2 good results, the current debate had arisen. In order to quell the debate, there had to be someone who had successfully cultivated the rebirth sword technique. It would be best if the person had reached level 10. However, after half a month had passed, there was still no one who had managed to master this complicated sword technique, which was a combination of 100 nurturing techniques. This caused the debate to become even more intense. However, these debates did not affect Feng Xingjian. In the past half a month, other than finding time to kill ferocious beasts to level up and go to the sword tower to observe, he spent almost every day and night practicing his sword arts with James. This also allowed him to successfully cultivate the Thunderbolt sword technique to the maximum level 40 and the Mountain shifting sword to the maximum level 7 times consecutively. Finally, he succeeded in combining the 2 sword techniques and obtained the Thunder Prison Earth sword. It was a powerful sword technique that could use electricity to stimulate the geomagnetic forces, turning flat lands into mountains and high mountains into valleys. It was a powerful sword technique that could change the terrain at will. It could even use the earth, which was a great conductor, to guide the power of thunderbolts and silently shock the opponent with electricity. Of course, not only had his sword techniques leveled up, Feng Xingjian's level had also increased. Even the prodigious astral divine powers waves had risen from level 1 to level 2. Therefore, after half a month, Feng Xingjian had risen to level 21. In addition to the continuous tempering of his attributes over the past half a month, his attributes had become name Feng Xingjian, age 17, occupation Heavenly Sword Sovereign level 21, strength 103 plus 7 agility 205 plus 7 reaction 100 endurance 76 flexibility 76 ether synchronization rate 24%. The attributes above come into effect once the prodigious astral divine powers waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 7 in strength and agility, 10% of the endurance attribute. Techniques, boundaries negation, level 40 rebirth sword technique, level 40 new 9-headed dragon sword technique, level 40 zenith light sword formation, level 40 ether sword ripples, level 4 ether divine art, level 40 thunder hell's word earth sword, level 14 aquatic sword formation, level 1 lightless sword specialties, genius swordsmanship, elementary survival instinct, internal healing, internal training sword, specialist, heightened reflexes, perfect muscles, single sword world subjugation, elementary berserkness, unparalleled sword intent, apex, sword bones, swordless path, darkness sword sense, heavenly sword imprint waves level 2 prodigious astral divine powers waves mental cultivation method level 5, universal sword dominance lunisolar potential 30,000 point increase / day within half a month. Feng Xingjian's strength had officially broken through to 100 points. Due to the upgrade of the prodigious astral divine powers waves, the prowess of the terra ingurgitation had increased once again, reaching a range of 2 kilometers. The tremendous improvement in his abilities allowed him to perform his sword arts at an increasingly faster speed. This also caused James to feel a little more pressure. Therefore, his cultivation speed became even faster. It could be said that it was a cycle that was getting better and better. On this day, Feng Xingjian was controlling several hundred streams of aquatic sword cheese, continuing to perform various sword techniques. The sword cheese moved about, and the air whistled. It was as if many high-frequency swords were slashing to and fro, trembling the air and releasing thunderous sounds. After cultivating for a while, he heard someone calling from outside. Fang Xingjian's ears twitched slightly, and he walked out. In the process of walking, he seemed to be jumping a little, as if he was in a good mood. When he opened the door, he saw Zhou Xingwen, who had previously tried to persuade Fang Xingjian to lend out the sacred land, standing at the door. He was holding onto a food container, grinning as he looked at Fang Xingjian. Xingjian, the newly arrived, level 20 lightning fish. The entire fish weighs a total of 15 jin. I've gotten someone to cut it up for you. This was not the first time Zhou Xingwen had come over from the sacred land for the past month. He walked into the room with great familiarity, opened the food container, and placed the plates on the table. TSK, this lightning fish is good stuff. Moreover, it's only the middle of August, which is when the lightning fish are at their most delicious. Moreover, there's still a little electricity in their bodies. When you eat them, there's a numbing sensation that stimulates the tongue. Fang Xingjian sat quietly at the side, but his eyes were fixed on the fish meat on the plate. The fish meat had been cut up according to the different parts. The belly, skin, and gills were all cooked according to different methods. Zhou Xingwen picked up a plate and placed it before Fang Xingjian. There was a piece of pink fish meat on it, and he said, "This is the belly of the fish, the fattest and most tender part of the entire lightning fish. A single lightning fish will only have at most 1/10 of this meat. It's best to eat it raw. You'll be able to feel its original tenderness and elasticity." As he spoke, he gulped down his saliva. As this part is the fattest and most tender, there's a high requirement for knife skills. If it's too thin, it won't have any chewiness. If it's too thick, it will feel greasy. I've specially invited a master chef from the regional chief's manor to cook this fish. Fang Xingjian casually grabbed a piece and ate it. In an instant, he could feel the juices of the meat gushing out. The meat was full of elasticity, as if it was jumping on his teeth. Coupled with the faint herbal sauce, the freshness of the fish was ignited. There was also the slight numbing sensation from the electric pulses, which further enhanced the taste of the lightning fish. There's also the belly, neck, and lean meat of the fish. These are all eaten raw. As for the fish's chin and bones, they're all barbecued with a secret sauce. The gills and eyes are cooked into a thick seafood soup. What gradually appeared before Fang Xingjian was an all-fish banquet that used an entire lightning fish as the main ingredient. When he drank the fish soup that was as thick as cream, Fang Xingjian's brows could not help but twitch a little. He looked at the fury and hatred in his chest and realized that they were slowly reducing. He felt assured. As expected, eating delicacies will reduce my hatred and fury a little. It's no wonder that after I entered the regional academy, I've never been enraged by the circulation of my mental cultivation method. Chapter 306. At the same time as he ate the lightning fish, streams of electricity started to flow through Fang Xingjian's nerves incessantly. Zhou Xingwen seemed to have seen Fang Xingjian's nerves tremble a few times after being stimulated by the electricity. He said, "After eating this lightning fish, it can also stimulate the nerves and improve the transmission of information. It can also increase one's reaction quality." After drinking the last mouthful of fish soup, Fang Xingjian smacked his lips and said, "This fish is really not bad." He then lifted his head and threw a glance at Zhou Xingwen, saying, "You've given me quite a lot of good stuff over the past half a month. If you have any requests, feel free to let me know." Zhou Xingwen was not someone who would do anything for no reason. He had been giving food to Fang Xingjian for such a long time, but he had never made any requests. It was just that the more Fang Xingjian ate, the easier it would be for him to make requests. Therefore, when he heard Fang Xingjian's words, Zhou Xingwen felt slightly agitated. However, his expression did not change as he said, "It's nothing. I just know that you like delicacies. Since I'm also quite well versed in this area, I'll bring some for you. Your future is bright. Just don't forget about me." Seeing that Fang Xingjian was still putting on an act, Fang Xingjian shook his head and said, "You're not being honest. I do like to eat, but if you continue to not say anything, I can find someone else to buy food for me." Hearing this, Zhou Xingwen immediately said, Xingjian, don't do this. Look at me. I've trained to be thick-skinned and have a glib tongue. Let me tell you, it's actually nothing much. I just saw that the books that you and Ferdinand published are selling very well. Given Zhou Xingwen's age and abilities, he had long since lost the courage to continue taking risks to strive for higher levels. Instead, he was more interested in things like wealth and power. After all, not every conferred knight would be able to endure loneliness and take the risk of becoming a vegetable or a lunatic in order to increase their abilities. This was especially so for Zhou Xingwen, who had already become a conferred knight. There were far too many things for him to enjoy. With just a wave of his hand, he would be able to summon countless beauties, endless delicacies, and even gold, silver, and jewels. Therefore, he became increasingly lazy to cultivate and instead immersed himself in various worldly pursuits. However, at the same time, he also knew that there were still many people above him who could easily crush him to death. This was why he had opened up a salon, a club, and acted as an intermediary for Westerners. He had even helped Wang Tiangang, who was ranked 9th in the academy. All of these were for the sake of forming a clique and finding a backer. And now, Fang Xingjian had appeared before him. The strength and talent that he had displayed made him feel that he was a rare commodity, which was why he wanted to get close to him. As for how to keep in touch with Fang Xingjian, in his opinion, the only way was to occupy common interests. However, Fang Xingjian shook his head and said, I've left the publishing of the books to Ferdinand. If you have any matters, you can look for him directly. I don't have much energy to spend on business. I know. Zhou Xingwen sat down next to Fang Xingjian and continued, I'm not talking about the physical book, but the part about the sword technique authorization. Sword technique authorization? You're talking about my rebirth sword technique? Fang Xingjian wiped his mouth with a piece of paper and said, Although my rebirth sword technique has been listed in the Knight's Handbook, it seems that no one has been able to master it. Do you think so highly of this sword technique? That's because the person who criticized it was blind. Zhou Xingwen seemed to have forgotten that the first time he had seen this sword technique, he had also been filled with disdain. However, Fang Xingjian had recently consulted Wang Tiangang, who had watched the rebirth sword technique previously. Fang Xingjian was not very clear about the sword technique's principles, but he only knew one thing, and that was that Wang Tiangang had secretly started to cultivate the rebirth sword technique. I think that in at most half a month's time, there will be someone who will be able to master the rebirth sword technique. Zhou Xingwen smiled and said in an ingratiating manner, That's why I've come to inform you in advance. I hope that you can hand over the authorization of the rebirth sword technique to me. I guarantee that I'll fight for the greatest benefits for you. The so-called authorization was for Zhou Xingwen to represent Fang Xingjian in discussing the price, duration, and other matters with those academies, factions, military, and other influences. After all, with how busy Fang Xingjian was, how could he possibly have the time to discuss business? One could well imagine how much Zhou Xingwen's status and reputation would increase if he were to be able to represent a sword technique like the rebirth sword technique. In Zhou Xingwen's opinion, this sword technique would be an epic-making sword technique, one that could even change the form of the entire world. In this aspect, Zhou Xingwen might be able to see further than Hops, who was purely pursuing the Tao. However, Fang Xingjian still shook his head and said, I've already agreed to hand this over to Ferdinand. His clan has some connections in a few academies. Then I don't have to do business with the academies. Zhou Xingwen said, Ferdinand's clan might have some connections in the academies, but they're just a regional clan after all. They probably won't be able to reach out to many other places. For example, the various major factions, the Holy Sea of Truth, the various mountains in the Empire's military, the secret agents, and the Forbidden Army. They probably aren't too familiar with these places, right? However, the Western society behind me, and I have a deeper background and will definitely be able to bring you more benefits. Our alliance will be a win-win situation. People in this world would refer to those people who came from the other side of the Western Sea, who had yellow skin and black eyes, as Westerners. Zhou Xingwen and Wang Tiangang were both descendants of Westerners, and the Western society that Zhou Xingwen had established was an organization that was similar to those from the same hometown. It was also the organization that he had invited Fang Xingjian to join in the past. Hearing Zhou Xingwen's suggestion, Fang Xingjian's heart skipped a beat. It might not be a big problem for Ferdinand to negotiate with the academies. However, if he were to negotiate with the other factions, the various armies, and the secret agents, he would not be able to back up his words. After all, Ferdinand's clan was not an aristocratic one to begin with. It would be much better if Zhou Xingwen's Western society could help him deal with these issues. Fang Xingjian nodded and said, "I think that we can give it a try. However, you guys won't have the final say. You can discuss the specifics with Ferdinand. Let me know the results after you're done." Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, Zhou Xingwen's spirits were lifted. He nodded toward Fang Xingjian and said, "Xingjian, trust me. You definitely won't regret this. The potential influence of our Western society is far from as simple as a school salon. I'll go look for Ferdinand now." As he spoke, Zhou Xingwen stood up excitedly. Suddenly, he said, "Oh, right, Xingjian, what else do you like to eat? I'll get someone to send it over in a few days. It doesn't matter what the ingredients are. As long as it's made from ferocious beasts and tastes good, it'll be fine." "All right then. I'll prepare it for you." With that, Zhou Xingwen smiled mysteriously, opened the door, and left. Not long after he left, James walked in. Chapter 307. The moment James entered, he said, "Why hasn't anyone managed to learn your rebirth sword technique after half a month has passed?" Fang Xingjian said calmly, "This is very normal. Before they prove the authenticity of the rebirth sword technique, they won't send highly talented geniuses to spend time cultivating it. Right now, the ones who are sent to verify the effects are definitely unimportant knights. With their talent, it's normal for them to take 1 or 2 months before they can learn it. My rebirth sword technique is still a little difficult." James shook his head. "You're really not nervous at all. You should know that you're under a lot of attack right now. Many people are calling you a liar." As he spoke, he sniffed and suddenly looked at the grilled fish on the table. "What's this?" "An all-fish banquet made from the lightning fish. There's still some skinny fish and grilled fish made from fish bones left. Do you want some?" James chuckled and sat down. Although this lightning fish isn't considered expensive, it'll still take some effort to get it. You really have a lot of good stuff. Fang Xingjian smiled and also grabbed a piece of fish to eat. The skinny fish was very compact to begin with, and with the grilled sauce on it, it was a rare delicacy. The fish bones were crispy to begin with, and after being grilled, they had a special charred fragrance. James said as he ate, "You haven't been to the Sword Tower much recently. Speaking of which, there's been a discovery there, but Hops doesn't have the time to study it. Recently, he's been focusing on the revamped aerial battle sword technique. Do you want to go take a look?" Fang Xingjian frowned and asked, "What exactly is it? Before I master the prodigious demolition sword, I don't want to be distracted by other things. Your progress is already fast enough. It's good to relax a little." Head of Department James continued, "Moreover, the item discovered this time is not ordinary. It was salvaged from a sunken ship, and it seems to be an item from ancient times. No one has been able to identify the words in it, but it should contain a set of sword technique." "Ancient era? What era is that?" Hearing that he could not even recognize the words, Fang Xingjian immediately wanted to reject studying it. He did not have the time to study history. However, James shook his head and said, "Didn't you take your cultural lessons seriously? Do you think I have time?" James pursed his lips and said, "The so-called ancient era is an era that was at least 2,000 years ago. It was an era full of mysteries and questions. Judging from the ruins that have been salvaged and explored, the ancient civilization was not bad. It might even have been stronger than it was now. However, due to a reason that has yet to be discovered, an unknown reason, the ancient era suddenly came to an end. Civilization weakened, and the various races and countries on the continent slowly developed. James sighed. What happened in ancient times is still a mystery even now. However, what is certain is that the martial techniques of that time have been developed to the peak. Thus, excavating the ancient era's remnants and obtaining the ancient era's martial techniques for research is very meaningful. Fang Xingjian had not expected that there would be such an ancient era in Miracle World. He was a little curious about what was going on in the ancient times. So he nodded and said, "Then I'll have to see it." Therefore, after the two of them finished eating the lightning fish, they headed straight for the sword gauntlet. Both of them were superhumans, so how fast could they be? Like a gust of wind, they arrived at the entrance of the sword gauntlet in the blink of an eye. James brought them to the depths of the sword gauntlet. In the center of the densely packed bookshelves, countless staff members were surrounding a metal board that was the height of a human, busying about. It was a crimson-red metal board that looked like it was burning with flames. From afar, there were many words and pictures on the metal board. Around the metal board, groups of staff members were searching for information and measuring parameters. Hop's disciple, Leon, the man who looked like a lion, was standing in the center, giving out instructions calmly. It's not the language of the previous dynasty. What about the minority races? Have you checked them out? None of them. It's not the language of the North either. It doesn't match the Sand countries either. The height and width have not changed, but the temperature has been changing. The highest is 120 degrees Celsius, and the lowest is 30 degrees Celsius. We've studied it based on the pictures. It should be a set of killing sword technique. We've compared it to the size of an ordinary man's finger. The words and pictures on it should have been carved by fingers. With James' arrival, everyone present lowered their heads in acknowledgement and then started to get busy again. Everyone seemed extremely excited, like cats who had smelled something fishy. That was indeed the case. Compared to aimlessly searching for synthesis formulas or extracting cultivation methods from known sword techniques, it was easier to get excited about an ancient sword technique. James walked to the front row, looked at the densely packed words on the metal board that was the height of a human, and asked, "How's the situation?" We haven't confirmed the source of the words, but we suspect that it has something to do with Westerners. We might need to invite a few Western masters over to assist in the research. Leon threw a slight glance at Fang Xingjian. Previously, he had been the one to check on Fang Xingjian's nurturing sword technique, but now it was his turn to report to Fang Xingjian. He continued, "However, Team Leader Hops doesn't plan on getting involved in this research for now. Therefore, we don't have the funds for it yet. To continue the research and invite other masters, all sorts of investments would require money." James nodded and looked toward Fang Xingjian. However, he discovered that Fang Xingjian had already opened his eyes and was staring at the ancient era's sword technique. Fang Xingjian's eyes were filled with astonishment and curiosity. He nodded to himself, feeling that this project could be handed over to Fang Xingjian to be the leader. However, just as he was about to speak, a burst of laughter rang out. A strange man with sword-like brows, starry eyes, and a head full of white hair walked in. He looked like an old man, yet also a young man. The moment he appeared, everyone present became nervous. "Senior James, long time no see." "What's senior?" The Sword Saint's reputation in the Eastern Sand region is much more resounding than mine. James smiled and introduced to Fang Xingjian. "Xingjian, this is the new sword arts master in our academy. He's Sasa from the Eastern Sand region and is a grandmaster in sword arts. You'll have to learn from him." Sasa shook his head and said, "Before senior, how would I dare to mention anything about being a grandmaster?" He then turned his gaze toward the ancient era's sword technique, and a scorching glow flashed in his eyes. "I have some clues about this sword technique. I once discovered a similar metal plate in the Eastern Sand region. I'd like to take on this project." A hint of conflict flashed in James' eyes as he looked toward Fang Xingjian. Fang Xingjian turned a deaf ear to their conversation from the beginning to the end. His attention was completely attracted by the metal plate before him. It was because he realized that he could read the words on it. It was because the words on it were known as Chinese characters in his world. XIN country's titular authority, Special Operations Team Leader Lin Ling's masterpiece. Chapter 308. Xian Country. Could it be the Xian Country from Earth? Xian Country was the homeland that Feng Xingjian had come from when he was on Earth. But does Xian Country have an organization called the Titular Authority? Moreover, this is something from the ancient era. Why would it be recorded in Xian Country's language? Looking at the red metal board before him, Feng Xingjian's mind instantly became a little chaotic. He could no longer hear the discussions around him, and he continued to read the content. The words on the metal board were very messy and messy. It was obvious that the person who had written it seemed to be very anxious and nervous, as if he had written it in agitation. Those who see this piece of dragon scale, remember, do not borrow the powers of demonic gods. Do not borrow the powers of demonic gods. Only the demonic gods themselves can defeat demonic gods. Remember, do not let them enter our world. Remember the following sword technique. This will be the key. However, the first few words have been crossed out, making it impossible for others to read the content. It was just a few simple sentences at the beginning. After that, it was a set of sword technique. Feng Xingjian did not look at the sword technique. Instead, he kept on reading the first few sentences. Demonic gods. What is the relationship between them and the evil gods? He suddenly thought of the words his mother had told him through the second prince. Never use magic prince. Never borrow the powers of the evil gods. What is the relationship between the two? Although he could understand the words on the board, the information contained within it was even more thought-provoking. It was as if one puzzle had turned into even more puzzles. Sighing, Feng Xingjian knew that with the clues he had now, it was impossible for him to understand the cause and effect. He could only lower his head and continue reading the content of the sword technique. The name of this martial technique was the Heaven's Volition sword technique. However, although it was called a sword technique, it was more like a sword intent. There were no specific sword moves, but a sword intent that nurtured the survival of the fittest. This metal board was known as the Dragon Scale. The introduction to the sword technique did not talk about how to nurture this sword intent. Instead, it talked about how to unlock the encrypted waves on the Dragon Scale so that one could absorb the Heaven's Volition sword intent from the Dragon Scale. There is only one Heaven's Volition sword intent, and it could only be cultivated by one person. Right now, Feng Xingjian had the Zenith Light Sword formation for long-range attacks, Ether Sword Ripples for close combat, Terra Ingurgitation for strength, Boundaries Negation for speed, and even the prodigious Demolition Sword which he had yet to master. In terms of battle prowess, he did not lack sword techniques that he had cultivated. However, the sword art hidden in the Dragon Scale before him seemed to be hiding a great secret. It piqued his interest and made him want to learn it very much. However, he was not the only one who was interested in this ancient artifact. Just as Feng Xingjian was reading the Dragon Scale, Sasa, who came from the Eastern Sand region and was known as a sword saint, was also talking to Head of Department James. Sasa's gaze was burning as he looked at the Dragon Scale. The reason he was interested in this was because he had read about it before. The Eastern Sand region was located in the extreme east of the Empire and was adjacent to the Sand Country in the east. It was constantly harassed by the Sand Country and could be said to be a region of war. There would be endless conflicts of various sizes almost every year, and the knights here would naturally not miss out on battles as well. As a level 29 conferred knight, Sasa was often at the front lines. He would either restrain the experts from the other party or attack some geniuses from the Sand Country. During one of the attacks, he had unintentionally obtained a secret manual from the Sand Country. He was not interested in the martial techniques recorded in the manual, but in the notes at the back of the manual, there was a record of something known as the Dragon Scale. This was how the author of the secret manual described the Dragon Scale. In ancient times, huge dragons soared and a dragon king soared into the sky, attempting to engulf the sun and become a god. In order to protect the world, the king of gods killed the huge dragons and then used the Dragon King scale armor to record the martial intent. The Dragon Scale is divided into many pieces, and the martial intent recorded a secret regarding invincibility in the world. It said that the first founder of the Sand Country, the heavenly monarch of the Blood Sea, managed to attain a breakthrough to the divine level and achieve great things because he had obtained a piece of the dragon's scale. He had originally treated the content as a myth from the Sand Country and the fantasies of an unsatisfied cultivator. However, the metal plate before him was exactly the same as the dragon's scale in the description. Its color is like blood, alternating between cold and hot. The divine runes were carved on it to retain its meaning, Sasa said to James. Head of department, this thing should be a sword technique that was recorded on paper by an expert from the ancient era who killed ferocious beasts and used their scale armor as a piece of paper. I've analyzed a similar historical site in the eastern sand region before. Let me analyze this as well. As he spoke, he gently stroked the dragon's scale with one hand, scanning its structure with his heaven's perception like an electronic scanner. When he saw many existences that resembled bone cells, his gaze became even more certain. Dragon scale. It's really a dragon scale. To think that this thing really exists. I've always thought that those barbarians from the Sand Country had made it up. The heavens are really on my side. With this, I'll have a greater chance of attaining the divine level. Hearing Sasa's request, Head of Department James did not have any objections. It was impossible for him to ignore the request of a level 29 expert. Moreover, in terms of cultivation, Sasa had a higher chance of being able to research the profoundness of the ancient era's relics compared to Feng Xingjian. Therefore, James only gave it some thought before nodding. He looked at Feng Xingjian and said, Xingjian, you can let Sasa take over this project. He then smiled. You can also work together with Sasa and gain some experience. To be honest, James's words and actions were all out of good intentions. He was too old and did not have many years left to live. Sasa, on the other hand, was a famous sword in the southeast and had the title of Sword Saint. Not only was he a level 29 conferred knight, but he was also a top-notch existence amongst level 29 conferred knights. Among level 29 experts, there would naturally be differences in strength. Different specialties, the number of synthesized skills, the types of jobs, and their attributes would all allow for a great disparity between experts who were also level 29. People like the first prince, who was about to step into the divine level, were naturally the strongest. All the level 29 experts who were striving for the divine level were in the first echelon. The second prince and the governors from the other 8 regions, who were talented and had a tremendous amount of resources but had yet to find a way to attain the divine level, were slightly weaker and belonged to the second echelon. Below them were the various veteran level 29 experts. They belonged to the third echelon. Below them were the young level 29 conferred knights from the regional academies. They belonged to the fourth echelon. Sasa was a top-notch character amongst the veteran level 29 experts. He was the standard third echelon and could enter the second echelon at any time. He had the chance to be on par with experts at the governor's level. More importantly, James was already old while Sasa was still young. James was now introducing Feng Xingjian to Sasa because he wanted the two of them to get on good terms. Feng Xingjian would be able to receive support and care. However, what James did not know was that Feng Xingjian was also very interested in the dragon scale. However, Feng Xingjian had the confidence that he would be able to absorb the sword intent from it before James revealed the results. Therefore, he did not object to James's suggestion. Chapter 309. There was a lot of competition between knights. From a knight apprentice to a knight, and then to a conferred knight, everyone had to compete their way up. They would fight for resources, rankings, and positions. Every knight was used to all sorts of competition. Sasa, the level 29 Sword Saint of the Southeast, was naturally used to competition. The legendary dragon scale contained unrivaled profoundness. This was not an ordinary research job, and Sasa would not allow others to get involved. From the very beginning, he had only planned to study the dragon scale by himself. Therefore, Sasa rejected directly. There's no need for that. I can study this ancient artifact alone. James said, How can we do that? This is the first project you're working on in our great Western region. How can we not give our full support? If others were to find out about this, they'd think that our Great Western Region Regional Academy is jealous of those with talent. There's really no need for that. Sasa rejected once again. Ancient artifacts mainly contain historical information and analysis of ancient cultures. It's useless even if there are more people. I alone will be enough. After being rejected consecutively, James also seemed to sense that something was wrong. He threw a glance at the dragon scale and asked, "Is it really enough for you alone? You'll need a few assistants to help you with the research, right?" You could give me a few assistants." Sasa did not wish to reject too firmly, but he still added, "But I'd like to keep this ancient artifact in my residence for now and protect it closely. After all, this is an important discovery, and any damage to it would be a great loss." James was about to agree, but Fang Xingjian could not allow Sasa to take the dragon scale away just like that. Otherwise, how would he be able to absorb the sword intent within it? Therefore, Fang Xingjian said directly, "The sword tower is very safe, and the researchers here are all professionals. There's no need for us to move it." Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, Sasa frowned. He had to explain patiently to James, but why would he need to explain to a little brat? He reprimanded him as a senior. "I've been studying ancient artifacts in the Eastern Sand region for over 10 years. Are you the one who knows more about this?" Many of these ancient relics were preserved using ether particles, and they might break down if we're not careful. There are too many people in the sword tower, and it's inevitable that something might go wrong. It's safer for me to take care of them personally. With Fang Xingjian's personality, how could he take the other party's reprimand to heart? He immediately retorted, "The sword tower also has a dormitory. Why don't you just stay here? The facilities, information, and personnel here are more complete. Are they going to follow you to your house?" Seeing how Fang Xingjian was debating with the sword saint, the assistants and students were all stunned. Hop's disciple, Leon, gulped as he looked at Fang Xingjian with a hint of admiration. To dare to go against a level 29 conferred knight, he did not know if Fang Xingjian was very daring or if he was brainless. On the other side, Sasa's aura suddenly changed. He glared at Fang Xingjian and said coldly, "Are you in charge of this project, or am I?" He turned to look at James and said, "Head of department, do all the students in the Great Western region teach the teachers how to research and cultivate?" Don't be anxious." He turned to look at Xingjian and used his reduced force field to send a message. "Xingjian, what's going on? Why are you going against Sasa?" Fang Xingjian replied, "I also wish to study this ancient relic. Moreover, I also feel that it's safer to keep it in the sword tower." Hearing that Fang Xingjian also wished to study the dragon scale, Sasa's eyes widened abruptly, as if killing intent was gathering in them. How could he possibly allow others to lay their hands on the secret of the dragon scale? Putting aside the fact that Fang Xingjian was merely a genius student, even if his parents and brothers were to come, he would not allow them to lay their hands on it. This was like trying to snatch meat from Sasa's mouth. How could he possibly tolerate this? Moreover, seeing how insistent Fang Xingjian was, Sasa could not help but suspect if Fang Xingjian also knew the secret of the dragon scale, or if he knew even more than he did. The corners of his lips curled up, and he suddenly changed his tone, saying, "Xingjian, what you say makes sense. Why don't we do it this way? You can study it with me. This ancient relic can also be kept in the sword tower. I still have some research on the ancient era. If you're interested, I can teach you." This was a retreat in order to advance. When Fang Xingjian became his subordinate, he would send him to look up the information and clean up the place. Fang Xingjian would not be able to get close to the dragon scale. He could even think of ways to get some information from Fang Xingjian. He might even be able to get more information about the dragon scale. James nodded, very much in favor of Fang Xingjian and Sasa building a good relationship. However, Fang Xingjian was already on his guard against Sasa. He did not wish for Sasa to find out that he could read Chinese characters and could even absorb sword intent. Therefore, he rejected firmly, "There's no need. It's better for us to study on our own." Sasa's gaze narrowed. The more it was like this, the more he felt that there was something wrong with Fang Xingjian. He tried to persuade him, "Xingjian, You haven't studied the things from the ancient era, right? The civilization from that era was completely different from the present. If there's no one to lead the way, you'll probably be wasting a lot of time. Fang Xingjian took a step back, shook his head, and said, I think it's better for me to study it alone. He looked at head of department James and said, I hope that I can be in charge of this ancient relic alone. In other words, he wanted to kick Sasa out. Everyone present looked at Fang Xingjian as if they were looking at a lunatic. To think that a conferred knight who had just completed his job transition wanted to kick out a level 29 conferred knight and work on his own? However, what astonished them even more was James's behavior. He did not reject Sasa right away. Instead, he frowned and seemed to be deep in thought. Fury surged in Sasa's heart as he looked at James and said, Head of department, all right, don't quarrel. James felt a slight headache. One was an important level 29 combatant, while the other was a super genius with a bright future. He did not wish to suppress either of them. Of course, he was more inclined towards Fang Xingjian. However, if he were to suppress Sasa just like that, what would the other people in the academy think? Just then, Fang Xingjian said, Let me be in charge of this project. I'll tell you the first 3 levels of the Pantheon Monument's profoundness in one go. James's gaze lit up, really? Sasa said furiously, Headmaster, how can you exchange benefits for something like this? Moreover, Fang Xingjian, if you want to announce it, then do it for free. To use this to threaten the academy. Do you still have any morals? Fang Xingjian said, I'll tell you tonight. James shook his head at Sasa and said, The profoundness on the Pantheon Monument is very important, but the academy is not an army. We won't force the students to hand over their comprehensions. If we want others to announce everything for free, that would be collective violence. Therefore, we'll only exchange our comprehensions with the students. And Fang Xingjian doesn't need money. He only agrees to use the profoundness on the monument in exchange for our support. I feel that this is very reasonable. After I've completely deciphered all 7 levels of the profoundness, I'll also place them in the Academy's library. This will be beneficial to the advancement of the entire regional academy. With the other parties standing on school's side, Sasa was unable to say anything in rebuttal. Moreover, looking at the students and teachers and the surroundings, it was impossible for him to say it in front of everyone. James tried to persuade him, but Sasa, you're an expert in the ancient era's relics. We won't completely stop you from researching them. How about this? Both you and Fang Xingjian can take turns to come into contact with the relics for a day. Each of you will be in charge of it. How about that? Chapter 310. Sasa gave it some thought, but could not think of any other way. Moreover, in his opinion, his cultivation was much higher than Fang Xingjian's. How could Fang Xingjian possibly be able to solve the secret to the dragon scale before him? Therefore, he nodded and said to Fang Xingjian, Young man, you're too arrogant. The ancient era's relics aren't as simple as you think. Without a teacher's guidance, you won't be able to come up with anything. You don't have to worry about that. How could Fang Xingjian possibly give Sasa any face? He looked at the dragon scale and said, Then let's start the first day with me. Sasa could not possibly be unable to even wait for a single day. He smiled and said, I wish you good luck. With that, he left calmly. The remaining assistants, Leon, and the others all exchanged glances, looking at Fang Xingjian with strange gazes. To compete with a level 29 conferred knight. Although it was not a direct competition of battle prowess, it seemed a little too arrogant. Although Fang Xingjian had the achievements of deciphering all 7 levels of the Pantheon Monument's mysteries and clearing the Killing Techniques Palace within a day, both of these things were more dependent on one's talent, and in order to decipher the ancient relics, one would need even more power and accumulation. Sasa's ether synchronization rate of 100% made his ability to receive information and investigate the ancient era's relics many times stronger than Fang Xingjian's. None of the people present thought highly of Fang Xingjian. Even James, who knew very well of Fang Xingjian's talent, did not think highly of him. It was because deciphering the ancient era's relics did not have much to do with talent. One would need to flip through materials to decipher the words and pictures, as well as to use heaven's perception to gather the information contained in the ancient era's relics. This research depended on accumulation and ether synchronization rate. In these two aspects, Feng Xingjian was at a disadvantage in all aspects. In the end, James still did not know why Feng Xingjian was so fixated on this ancient era's relic. He shook his head and asked, "Why do you have to do this?" Feng Xingjian said, "I'm sorry, I have my reasons." However, although Feng Xingjian knew his own reasons, most people did not see it the same way. In less than an afternoon, the news of Feng Xingjian challenging Sasa had spread throughout the academy. In a room where the ancient era's relic was located, groups of members of the Sword Tower came over to surround Feng Xingjian. They seemed to want to know why he was so confident. Feng Xingjian ignored the gazes of the people around him and calmly read the Chinese characters carved on the dragon scale. In the eyes of the crowd, Feng Xingjian was staring blankly at an ancient artifact. Why didn't Feng Xingjian do some research? Could it be that he knows the words on it? How is that possible? We've been looking for it for almost 5 days, but we still haven't found the corresponding characters. How could he recognize it? Is he in a daze? This lad is really arrogant. He's only 17 years old and has just completed the second transition for over a month. To think that he dares to challenge a sword saint. It's good for youngsters to suffer a little. Otherwise, people would think that the geniuses of our great Western region are extremely arrogant. Feng Xingjian's results in clearing the Pantheon Monument and the Killing Techniques Palace were eye-catching. However, there were also people who were jealous of his results and the 50,000 gold that the head of department had given him. In the end, both conferred knights and knights would have to fight for resources. After all, resources were limited. Feng Xingjian had occupied the sacred land with 100 times the density, consumed a tremendous amount of ferocious beasts and cultivation materials every day, and had even received 50,000 gold from the sword arts department. Therefore, there were naturally people who had received lesser resources. Even if it was not Feng Xingjian who had taken the resources, the assistants might not have taken them either. However, they knew that, at the very least, the resources had been snatched away by Feng Xingjian. All right, what are you all looking at? All of you go and do your own work." Leon let out a loud bellow like a lion, chasing away the surrounding crowd. He then walked up to Feng Xingjian and said, Hee, some people are just jealous. They don't want others to get what they can't get. Why don't they think that even without you, they'll still be able to get a good ranking in the academy?" He then looked at the dragon scale curiously and asked, "Is it all right for you to study it like this? Do you need me to help you move some materials?" Feng Xingjian wanted to shake his head, but at the next moment, he felt that he was being too ostentatious. Therefore, he said, "Help me move some research materials from the ancient era. I'll have to trouble you." Leon said with a forthright expression, Just you wait. Leave it to me." However, after being chased away by Leon a few times, there were still groups of people who came to watch Feng Xingjian. However, Feng Xingjian was unmoved. That night, he had already finished reading the sword technique on the dragon scale and was planning on absorbing the sword intent within it. He pressed one of his palms on the dragon scale, sensing the temperature that fluctuated between cold and hot. The changes in temperature were due to the constant changes in the frequency of the dragon scale's waves, causing his temperature to change as well. Different wave frequencies contain different information, just like the electronic signals in modern society. Right now, what Feng Xingjian needed to do was to decipher this encrypted message and gain the dragon scale's acknowledgement. Only then would he be able to absorb the sword intent within it. He pressed his hand on the dragon scale and continued to use his heaven's perception to read the information within, slowly deciphering the secrets within. He felt as if his consciousness had sunk into a small river. There were countless whirlpools and ripples in the river, and only by clearly seeing the trajectory of the ripples would he be able to pierce through their weak points, allowing him to swim about in the river unscathed. Once he collided with the ripples and a new ripple was created, his consciousness would be thrown out, and he would have to start from the beginning. This was also the first time that Feng Xingjian had encountered an encryption technique that used ether particles. Therefore, he had failed many times in the beginning before he gradually started to delve deeper into the dragon scale. Just like that, a few days passed by. Feng Xingjian and Sasa took turns to come into contact with the dragon scale, and the number of people watching Feng Xingjian also decreased. However, the people who saw that Feng Xingjian was often in a daze were even more pessimistic about Feng Xingjian's chances. In the Sword Arts Department's Killing Techniques Palace, Holt was practicing the Thunderbolt sword technique. Norman, who had been by his side, suddenly dashed in excitedly and said, "Holt, do you know? Feng Xingjian is stirring up trouble again." Holt's brows twitched. What did he do? Norman then told Holt about what had happened, smiling and saying, "I treated a senior from the Sword Tower to a meal." According to him, Feng Xingjian has been staring at the metal sheet in a daze. He's only 17 years old and has never studied the ancient era's relics before. I think he's gone silly. Holt stopped practicing the Thunderbolt sword technique. Although there was no expression on his face, he felt a little happier. He said calmly, "It's not strange for a 17-year-old conferred knight who has transitioned for over a month to not be able to win against a sword saint. Even if he were to lose, he would still be an unrivaled genius. However, I only find it a pity that he's wasting his time on meaningless things." However, he paused for a moment before saying, "Norman, help me find out more about him. He's quite interesting." Thinking of how Feng Xingjian would be crushed and taught a lesson by a sword saint, Holt was still quite happy despite not wanting to show it. This was what it meant to gloat. This was a human instinct, and Holt was no exception. He thought to himself, talent isn't omnipotent. For example, in studying the ancient era's sword techniques, talent isn't a necessity. Norman was very familiar with Holt, so how could he not understand what Holt was thinking? He even added, "Got it. I'll go and find out more about the situation." Holt watched as Norman left excitedly and sighed. It's because this guy doesn't focus on martial arts that he hasn't improved for so many years. However, the hint of a smile at the corner of his lips betrayed him. Chapter 3:11. Xingjian, you're here again? How's the progress of the analysis? Have you figured out the origins of those ancient era's words? Almost there. I heard that Sword Saint Sasa has already analyzed the first 200 words. Xingjian, you'll have to work hard as well. Seeing Feng Xingjian leave with an indifferent expression, the student who had asked the question let out a cold snort and thought to himself, he's just putting on an act. Feng Xingjian continued to head toward the room where the dragon scale was. Along the way, there were many people who greeted him and asked him about the progress of his analysis of the ancient era's relics. He answered them casually. Leon walked over and could not help but glare at the students who walked past him. He patted Feng Xingjian's shoulder and said, "Don't take it to heart. A 17-year-old genius, a 17-year-old conferred knight. These people are very jealous and are waiting to see you make a fool of yourself." "It's fine," Leon continued. "Right now, Sasa has basically confirmed that the words on the relic do not belong to any of the known languages. He has invited a language expert to analyze the words together with him. It's said that this is a type of hieroglyphic writing. Their progress is very fast." "Is that so?" Feng Xingjian said. Leon said, "Aren't you nervous? The other party is a famous sword expert in the southeast, an expert with the title of Sword Saint. That Eastern Sand region's Sword Saint is really cheap." Leon smiled bitterly and said, "You're really ambitious." As the two of them spoke, they arrived at the room where they had visited the dragon scale. They saw that Sasa and a few other elderly men were flipping through the materials and debating the meaning of each word while surrounded by over 10 people. They should be talking about sword intent here. They're talking about the sword intent inside, but is that really possible? A sword intent that has existed for 2,000 years? Even if it's still here, there's nothing left, right? While the few of them were debating, Feng Xingjian squeezed through the crowd and walked up to the dragon scale. "Time's up. I'll be in charge for the rest of the day. Sasa threw an impatient glance at Feng Xingjian. However, they had already copied down all the words on the dragon scale. Even if they were not in front of the dragon scale, it would not affect them from analyzing the meaning. All right, let's go. Sasa left with the experts. Some of the onlookers also left, but some stayed behind to see how Feng Xingjian would analyze it. However, Feng Xingjian said, "Everyone, have you seen enough? I don't wish to disturb you today, so please leave." Only then did the group of people leave helplessly, leaving Feng Xingjian alone to continue analyzing the waves. As his consciousness got closer and closer to the source of the ripples on the dragon scale, he could feel an extremely sharp and incisive aura stirring, as if it had just woken up from a deep slumber of thousands of years. He could feel that as the words continued to analyze the ripples on the dragon scale, he was getting closer and closer to the sword intent stored within. In a few more days, he would be able to truly come into contact with his sword intent. In another office, the head of the sword arts team and the owner of the sword tower, Hops, was looking through the experimental reports during this period of time. He ascertained that there were no problems with the general direction of all the projects and also ascertained the direction for the next few months. Next to him, Leon drank his coffee and said, "Teacher, between Feng Xingjian and Sasa, who do you think will win?" "The two of them. What do you guys think?" Hops started to test his students without even lifting his head. A silver-haired young man who looked to be in his 20s said sourly, "Feng Xingjian's talent isn't bad, but when it comes to analyzing ancient relics, it's not talent but experience." Sasa has already started to analyze the words, while Feng Xingjian, he hasn't even flipped through the materials yet. I think he'll definitely lose. Leon smiled. Hee, junior marshal brother, you're jealous. What's there to be jealous about? I'm just speaking the truth. Leon, do you think that he'll be able to win against Sasa? Leon shook his head and said, "To win against Sasa, it's too difficult." "Teacher, what do you think?" Hops said calmly, "Under normal circumstances, no matter what he does, it's unlikely that Feng Xingjian will be able to win against Sasa. But the problem is, do you guys think that Feng Xingjian is an idiot?" "Of course not," Leon said. "If a person who can solve the sword techniques in the Killing Techniques Palace within a day is an idiot, then wouldn't all of us be pigs? Then since Feng Xingjian isn't an idiot and he's the one who fought for this fight, he naturally has his own confidence. Therefore, I can't tell who will win." His junior frowned and said, "Could it be that Feng Xingjian is too arrogant?" Hops said calmly, "Never think of others as too stupid. This is especially so in battle. Never place your hopes of winning on other people's mistakes." Another day passed, and Sasa let out a big yawn. Although most conferred knights no longer needed to sleep, he still felt a little tired after continuously depleting a large amount of his brain power to parse words like he had been doing for the past few days. After all, parsing words was akin to making guesses, arranging all sorts of possibilities, and then continuing to eliminate the possibility of mistakes. It was also thanks to the fact that Sasa was no longer like a human. His powerful level 29 abilities allowed his brain to be like a supercomputer, allowing him to store countless pieces of information in his brain and then continue to compare and guess the possibilities. Thinking of how tired he had been for the past few days, Sasa suddenly smiled in self-mockery. He felt that he had been too careful. His opponent was just a young man who had just transitioned a month ago. Was there a need for him to work so hard? But this is good as well. I'll have to suppress these geniuses. Otherwise, they'll really think that their talent is unrivaled and they'll look down on their seniors. Thinking of the progress of the parsing over the past few days and how smooth everything had been, Sasa felt as if he was sitting on the moon fishing platform. As he walked toward the room where the dragon scale was, there were many people who greeted Sasa. "Lord Sword Saint, you're here again? Good morning, Lord Sword Saint." Sasa smiled and greeted everyone along the way. His smile was like a spring breeze, closing the distance between him and the others in an instant, giving off an amiable and approachable feeling. This was also the image that Sasa had always maintained. He had an elegant demeanor and was like a spring breeze, just like a scholar who had read a lot of books. He gave off the feeling that he was very cultured. However, when he got close to the dragon scales room, he suddenly frowned. An assistant walked up to him and greeted him. "Come on, Lord Sasa. How's the research going?" However, Sasa turned his head abruptly, and his gaze was extremely sharp. That assistant could not help but take a few steps back, feeling as if his body had been pierced through and his entire body trembled. However, Sasa did not have the time to pay attention to this. He stared at the dragon scale and Feng Xingjian in the room. He could sense a sword intent, or rather, an information flow, coming out bit by bit from the dragon scale. It was currently exchanging information with Feng Xingjian. How is this possible? This kid has already reached this level? Chapter 312. Sasa, who had been progressing very quickly over the past few days and had felt that everything was going smoothly, saw the scene of Feng Xingjian communicating with the dragon scale. He felt as if a basin of cold water had been poured over his head, and he felt a chill run down his spine. He had just deduced that there was a stream of sword intent hidden in the dragon scale, but Feng Xingjian seemed to have already made contact with it. He could imagine how much glory Feng Xingjian would receive if he were to win against him in the analysis of the ancient era's artifact. However, he could also imagine how much contempt and mockery he would receive if he were to fail after being used as a stepping stone by Feng Xingjian. This was not just a matter of his reputation. At the very least, the support the Great Western Regional Academy had for him would be greatly reduced. Moreover, the dragon scale was the secret of being unrivaled in the world. How could he possibly allow others to lay their hands on it? This was what Sasa could not tolerate the most. It was only then that he thought of a problem that he had never considered before. What would be the outcome if he were to lose to Feng Xingjian? The secret of the dragon's scale, even if it's not really unrivaled in the world, as it can allow the heavenly lore of the Blood Sea to attain a breakthrough to the divine level, I must not let Feng Xingjian snatch it away. Sasa's gaze sharpened as he thought of this outcome. This can't go on. In an instant, he returned to his original appearance, as if he had not discovered anything. He smiled and walked up to Feng Xingjian. "Your progress isn't bad. You've solved the secret of the artifact?" "Not yet." Feng Xingjian's brows furrowed, and he helplessly stopped his communication with the sword intent. Although he had come into contact with the sword intent, he discovered that this sword intent, or rather, the information remnant left behind by a certain person, was like the information remnant in the level 29 superior grade set, the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. It already had a simple consciousness. He wanted to absorb this sword intent according to the method recorded in the dragon scale, but he realized that the other party ignored him and was not willing to be absorbed by him. He tried to communicate with it for an entire night. Just as he was showing some signs of improvement, he was interrupted by Sasa. Moreover, with Sasa's arrival, the sword intent had completely retracted back into the dragon scale and could no longer be sensed. Hating Sasa's interruptions, Feng Xingjian stood up. He could not be bothered with Sasa and walked out with big strides. During this period of time, other than analyzing the dragon scale, he also wanted to cultivate his sword arts. However, Sasa stopped him and said with some enthusiasm, "Xingjian, do you want to have a discussion with us? You might not be able to come up with a comprehensive plan by yourself. I've specially invited a few experts from the Eastern Sand region to come over. Do you want to exchange your views with us?" Feng Xingjian. Xingjian turned and threw him a glance. Feng Xingjian. Feng Xingjian. Displeased Feng Xingjian, looking to look Feng. However, Feng Xingjian only said calmly, "Not interested." With that, he turned and left. This lad, Sasa's face twitched. As a famous swordsman in the southeast, when had he ever been treated so rudely? Even someone like the governor would treat him with respect. Otherwise, he would be said to be arrogant and conceited. I can't just let this go. Many schemes kept on flashing in Sasa's mind. As a level 29 conferred knight who had killed his way through the battlefield, Sasa had never been a good person in the traditional sense of the word. On the battlefield, he had killed countless enemies. It was because those who only knew how to attack head-on and fight fiercely would not be able to survive to the very end. Oh, right. His rebirth sword technique must have caused a lot of controversy recently. Sas's eyes narrowed slightly. He walked out the door, saw an assistant, and said, Feng Xingjian's rebirth sword technique. The sword tower has it, right? Bring it over, and let me take a look. He started to laugh coldly in his heart. If this sword technique of yours is really filled with all sorts of poisons, then forget it. But if I were to find even the slightest flaw, then don't blame me for being ruthless. In his opinion, it was impossible for a self-created sword technique like Feng Xingjian, a 17-year-old genius, to be flawless. I can think of other ways to deal with it. At Sasa's position, the resources in society were too abundant. He had too many cards in his hands to deal with a student from a regional academy, even if the student was a great genius. However, Feng Xingjian did not know what was going on. He continued to work hard on his sword arts daily and communicate with the sword intent hidden in the dragon scale. However, that sword intent was like a disobedient child who had just opened his eyes to see the world. It kept flashing and appearing, hiding whenever there were any slight changes. This made it impossible for Feng Xingjian to communicate with it properly, let alone absorb it. Even when he tried to absorb it according to the method inscribed on the dragon scale, the sword intent remained unmoved, unwilling to enter Feng Xingjian's body even after a long time. On this day, Feng Xingjian once again arrived at the sword tower. However, he was stopped by a man who was hiding in a cloak. The man handed him a stack of documents and said calmly, If you want to resolve this matter, come and look for me at the mountain behind the academy at this time tomorrow. With that, the man left. Feng Xingjian frowned and opened the document on the spot. There were only about 5 pages in the document, and most of them were names and data. However, the content was a little shocking. It recorded the situation of a sword arts dojo. 3 of their students had practiced a type of sword technique, and within a short period of 1 week, all of them had suffered from varying degrees of internal injuries. Although it was not directly stated that the injuries were caused by this sword technique, the comparison of the data was too obvious. Even if it was Feng Xingjian, after seeing this set of data, would feel that the internal injuries on their bodies were caused by practicing the new sword technique. Moreover, the name of this sword technique was the rebirth sword technique. Looking at the document in his hands, Feng Xingjian's heart sank. The sample size of 3 students was too small. However, all 3 of them had suffered from internal injuries, and the situation was too serious. My rebirth sword technique is definitely perfect. Why would there be internal injuries? Suddenly, Sasa walked over, smiled, and said, What's wrong, Xingjian? Are you in a bad mood? Feng Xingjian threw a cold glance at Sasa, then put the document away and left. After Feng Xingjian left, Sasa's countenance sank. He looked at Feng Xingjian's back as if he was looking at a dead man. You can continue to be arrogant while you still have the time. I'm looking forward to seeing how the association will deal with you after they find out about the problem with the rebirth sword technique. Thinking of this, the corners of Sasa's lips curled up slightly, and he left in a good mood. Lord Sasa, you seem to be in a good mood. Is the analysis going well? Haha, it's going well. It shouldn't be long before it's solved. Chapter 313. Walking up to the dragon scale, Feng Xingjian let out a breath, as if all his worries and troubles had been exhaled from his mouth. Although the document earlier had made him feel that it was troublesome, it was useless to think about these things now. On the other hand, the matter regarding the dragon scale was also very important. It was better for him to compete with Sasa every day. If he were to waste this time, it would only create new troubles on top of that document. Therefore, Feng Xingjian forcefully put aside the matter regarding the document and once again focused all of his consciousness on the dragon scale. With the help of his heaven's perception, his consciousness leaned toward the dragon scale. Perhaps it was because of the document, or perhaps it was because of the instinct in his mind. This was because Feng Xingjian's consciousness did not carry the information in the Empire's language. Instead, it was from Earth, from Xin country, from the instinctive language in his body, Chinese characters. A person's mother tongue was usually the language that the person's brain instinctively used to think. Today, Fang Xingjian had subconsciously used his heaven's perception to send the information over in the form of Chinese characters. Then something unexpected happened. Amidst Fang Xingjian's astonishment, the heaven's volition's sword intent, which had been avoiding him and unwilling to pay any attention to him, was now like a curious baby, slowly extending out from the dragon scale. Fang Xingjian could sense waves of ripples sweeping through his body, as if wanting to communicate with him. Fang Xingjian hesitated for a moment before sending another message. "You can understand Chinese?" Sword intent was formless and immaterial. However, at this moment, Fang Xingjian seemed to have felt the sword intent tremble a little, and a joyful message was sent over. Sword intent is ultimately a cultivator's information remnant. It's also a type of information flow. However, it's different from the heavenly abyss annihilation armor. What's condensed in it is the cultivator's spirit, will, and understanding towards sword arts. If the information remnant in the heavenly abyss annihilation armor is the cultivator's memories and emotions, then the information remnant in the dragon scale is pure emotions. And in the long wait, this emotion gradually gained some intelligence. When it heard Chinese, it had a reaction that seemed like it was happy. Is it because he was born from the emotions of a certain martial artist, so he relies on instinct to act? In that case, aren't they similar to animals like kittens and puppies? Therefore, after that, Fang Xingjian kept sending Chinese characters into the interior of the dragon scale. He could feel the sword intent in its surging increasingly. It was as if he had just woken up, but the continuous stream of Chinese characters made him more and more awake. As the Chinese characters continued to spread, Fang Xingjian could also sense that the sword intent was no longer as wary of him as it was in the past. Instead, it was gradually getting familiar with him. Fang Xingjian could now feel the waves of the sword intent hitting his body. It was as if the other party was using its tentacles to study him. Very cautious, but in the end, it doesn't have true intelligence. You like Chinese characters, so you can become familiar with me. What else would you like? Fang Xingjian's eyes lit up, and he suddenly understood. Since it was sword intent, it was naturally interested in sword theory. Fang Xingjian gave it some thought and sent the information related to the new nine-headed dragon sword technique in his mind over in Chinese. The sword intent in the dragon scale seemed to fall silent for a moment. Then at the next moment, a gush of ecstasy gushed forth. It was a tremendous amount of information flow, but it was only filled with the information of happiness. It was as if countless words of ecstasy had been copied and sent over to Fang Xingjian's brain. The information flow gushed toward Fang Xingjian's brain and consciousness. However, the moment it got close, the heavenly abyss annihilation armor reacted. Romalov's martial will soared up abruptly, gushing forth like a sandstorm, clashing against the sword intense information flow. However, when the heavenly abyss annihilation armor, which could easily crush low-level conferred knights, and Damarov's martial will, which could suppress Fang Xingjian, encountered the sword intense information flow, it was like tofu bumping into a kitchen knife. It was easily sliced into countless pieces, allowing the sword intense information flow to gush into Fang Xingjian's brain. What? Before he could react, the information flow had already gushed into his brain. Fang Xingjian held onto his head, feeling as if his brain was overloaded. He retreated over 10 steps before coming to a stop. He lifted his head and looked at the dragon's scale, feeling for the first time how terrifying the sword intent in the dragon scale was. Who on earth left this sword intent behind? The heavenly abyss annihilation armor's martial will is already the remnant information of a level 29 expert. Moreover, it's the remnant information of a level 29 expert's corpse. This sword intent is a stream of sword intent left behind by my master. To think that a casual information flow attack is able to slash through the heavenly abyss annihilation armor's full defense. Then how powerful must the person who left behind this sword intent be? Divine level? Or perhaps even stronger? Feng Xingjian looked at the dragon scale, and after a series of thoughts, his gaze became even more fervent. Such a powerful sword intent. If he could get his hands on the sword intent and the power within it, how much would his abilities increase? After giving it some thought, Feng Xingjian rubbed his aching head and once again walked toward the dragon's scale, probing it with his consciousness. The probing earlier had made him understand that the Heaven's Volition sword intent was very fond of sword arts. Therefore, if he were to think of a way to give it some benefits, he would still be able to use sword arts to lure it out. Therefore, a thought flashed through Feng Xingjian's mind. He sent over 1/10 of the lightless sword's contents that he had just learned. Once again, there was great joy. However, this time around, Feng Xingjian was prepared. Although his head was still in great pain, he treated it as training his martial will and martial spirit. Sensing the hunger coming from the dragon scale, Feng Xingjian started to transmit information and ask questions. Come into my body. As long as you come into my body, I'll send you the rest of the sword technique's contents. In the dragon scale, Feng Xingjian could sense the sword intent's struggle, hesitation, and hunger. This sword intent had already developed some intelligence. Although it could not speak or write, it could allow people to sense the basic changes in its emotions, just like animals like cats and dogs. Feng Xingjian tried sending some sword techniques over, but they could only make the sword intent hesitate. They were unable to make it come out and enter his body. Just like that, in the end, Feng Xingjian sent over the first 2,000 words of the rebirth sword technique. This set of sword technique was created by combining 100 sets of nurturing sword techniques. It's a perfect sword technique for nurturing sword techniques. It was just a simple 2,000 words, but the sword intent was already cheering excitedly. It was as if it was on drugs, and even the entire dragon scale seemed to be trembling. Feng Xingjian stared at the dragon scale. Do you want this set of sword technique? If you do, then come over to me. After seeing this set of sword technique, you should be able to understand my talent. With my talent in sword arts, I'll be able to create many sword techniques like this in the future. No, it'll be many sword techniques that are even stronger than this. If you want it, then come over to me. In that instant, the entire dragon scale trembled violently, and the sword intent seemed to be struggling to an extreme. Right now, in its eyes, Feng Xingjian was like a piece of fresh, tender, and juicy meat. Therefore, under Feng Xingjian's excited gaze, he could sense that there was something invisible and intangible in the dragon's scale. It truly existed. It was coming out bit by bit. Chapter 314. Just as the Heaven's Volition sword intent in the dragon scale was stirring, as if it would leap into Feng Xingjian's embrace at any moment, a cough rang out behind Feng Xingjian. The Heaven's Volition sword intent retracted abruptly and returned to the dragon scale, disappearing without a trace. A wave of fury rose in Feng Xingjian's heart. He stood up abruptly and looked behind him. He saw Sasa standing there apologetically, saying, "I'm sorry, Xingjian. I saw that it was about time and came over. Did I disturb you?" Killing intent seemed to be gathering on Feng Xingjian's face. Anyone who had encountered the situation earlier, being disturbed just as the Heaven's Volition sword intent was about to enter their body, causing all their efforts to go to waste, would probably be so infuriated that they would want to kill someone. This was especially so as he had finally managed to lure the sword intent out after much difficulty. He did not know if he would be able to succeed the next time around. This made the killing intent in Feng Xingjian's heart even more intense. However, he knew that he was currently not a match for Sasa, a level 29 conferred knight. Therefore, he did not really make a move. He merely threw a cold glance at Sasa, remembered what had happened, and then left. However, in Sasa's eyes, his actions were already very disrespectful. Feng Xingjian, you won't have the time to mess around with my dragon scale anymore." Thinking of the secret in the dragon scale, Sasa could not help but feel a strong desire. The secret hidden in the dragon's scale might not be invincible, but it was also related to attaining the divine level. Sasa was determined to get his hands on such an important item, and he would not allow anyone else to get their hands on it. I must get my hands on the secret to the dragon's scale before Fang Xingjian does. As for whether he would destroy the dragon's scale, kill all the researchers, or do something else, it would all depend on what secret Sasa had gotten his hands on. However, it was no longer just about being the first. Seeing how confident Fang Xingjian was, in order to monopolize the secret, Fang Xingjian was determined to stop him from continuing. Fang Xingjian was infuriated, and he quickened his pace. He dashed out like a sharp sword, leaving behind many deep sword marks on the ground of the sword tower. However, with the mental cultivation method running, his brain still maintained a basic level of calmness. Thinking about the documents he had obtained, he rushed to the agreed place. Like a gust of wind, Fang Xingjian arrived at the small path at the back of the mountain and saw a man in black standing there. It was the man who had given him the documents yesterday. Seeing Fang Xingjian's arrival, the man said, "You're here. How is it? Did you break out in a cold sweat after seeing this data report?" To think that there would be such a huge flaw in the nurturing technique that he had put in so much effort to create. Fang Xingjian said coldly, "Who are you? What do you want?" "I want you to go to the Sand Country and help me search for something." The man sneered and said, "If you don't agree, this data report will appear on the Knight Association's report." The Knight's Handbook was published by the Knight Association. Naturally, the Knight Association would be responsible for any problems with the sword techniques published in the handbook. Throughout history, there had been many cases of people plagiarizing and faking their martial techniques, and those conferred knights had all ended up in a miserable state. The Knight Association managed over 100,000 knights and conferred knights across the entire empire. How much authority do they have? In order to protect their prestige, and authority, the moment they were discovered to be faking or plagiarizing, they would be dealt with very badly. First of all, their knight qualifications would be revoked, and then they would be fined heavily. Even their powers would be crippled to varying degrees, depending on how serious the situation was. If it was more serious, they would be charged with treason. Of course, even the simplest warning would probably cause the knight to no longer be able to get any cultivation resources, and they would no longer be able to find a way out in the empire. Any academy or influence would reject the entry of such a knight. Therefore, the black-clothed man's threat was very serious, even serious. However, Fang Xingjian let out a cold laugh and said, "It's impossible for there to be any problems with my rebirth sword technique. For the 3 students in this dojo to suffer from internal injuries, there must be some other interfering factor. Therefore, I won't accept your threat." Fang Xingjian had the world's top sword arts talent. So how could he not be confident in his own sword arts? It was because he understood his own sword arts too well and understood each and every movement of the rebirth sword technique. This was why he knew that there would not be any problems with the rebirth sword technique. The rebirth sword technique was formed by refining the essence of 100 sets of nurturing sword techniques. Which of those 100 sets of nurturing sword techniques had not been tempered and tempered? The problem could only be with the cultivator and not with the rebirth sword technique. This was Fang Xingjian's own confidence in his sword arts, as well as his judgment based on his high level of sword arts. It was because of this that he would not panic the moment he received the news, which might even affect his analysis of the sword intent or cause him to be flustered when the other party made a request. With a casual move, a stone sword darted out from the ground and was held in his hand. With the reinforcement from the swordless path, it became a level 19 inferior divine weapon. Fang Xingjian said calmly, "I'm not interested in your threat. The reason why I'm here is to see who on earth dares to threaten me. The thing I hate the most in my life is people threatening me." As he spoke, Fang Xingjian's body moved. There seemed to be a stream of electricity piercing through the air, and a sword light appeared on the black-clothed man's neck. Feng Xingjian said calmly. Now, let me see who on earth you are. The ether sword ripples swept through the man's cloak, and the black cloak was instantly torn into pieces. However, what was revealed was not a real person, but a native. The native opened his mouth and said with a smile, Feng Xingjian, we've long known that you're arrogant and unreasonable. You'll make a move at the slightest disagreement. How could I possibly rush over to tangle with you? At the next moment, the native said coldly, leave the academy within 3 days and head to the Sand Country to await further instructions. Otherwise, you can wait for the association's investigation. After saying this, the native disintegrated in that instant, turning into fine sand on the ground. Feng Xingjian looked at the fine sand on the ground and started to ponder. Sand Country? They want my heavenly abyss annihilation armor? Someone from the Sand Country? The only people that Feng Xingjian could think of who would do this seemed to be the people from the Sand Country. They wanted to lure him to the Sand Country and get the heavenly abyss annihilation armor. No matter what, it was a divine weapon forged from the remains of their national hero. 3 days. At the thought of this, Feng Xingjian turned to leave. Of course, it was impossible for him to head to the Sand Country. From here to the Sand Country and back, it would take at least a month's time. How could he possibly waste his time on this? Moreover, he did not need to handle this alone. In the head of department's office. What? Someone has suffered from internal injuries after cultivating your rebirth sword technique? Is it because of internal organ failure? Feng Xingjian sent the set of data to James, the head of department, and said, it can't be a problem with the sword technique. There could only be other factors that have interfered. But if we really get them to submit this to the association and let them come over to investigate, it'll be troublesome. It's not just troublesome. James frowned and said, those bureaucrats can create trouble for no reason at all. Even if it's proven that there's no problem with us, you and I, or even the entire academy, might be skin alive. You don't have to bother about this. I'll get someone to handle it. Let's think of a way to shut up this dojo first. Then things will be easier. That you're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.